Hey folks, welcome, welcome, welcome. I called this live August of Power. I was thinking about calling it Guns of August, but I didn't want people to think I was saying that the world was on the brink of a new world war. So I didn't call it Guns of August, but I wanted to give it a theme that was tied in with August, with the hot summer that we've got going on, with geopolitics, with everyone being on edge, with the world's situation being the way it is. So much for us to talk about here on YouTube Live this afternoon. Now, I am going to do what you all should be doing right now. I'm going to tweet out the announcement that the live conversation, interactive conversation with me, radical journalist, political analyst, scratch the radical part, journalist and political analyst who happens to sometimes say things that are a little bit out of the mainstream. We are going to begin the conversation. So do what I'm doing right now. Take the opportunity to tweet out that we are about to begin, that we are having our chat. The conversation starts now. Join me on YouTube Live. We are beginning what will be, my hope, an amazing conversation, an amazing chat. Welcome, Simon Lawrenson. Welcome, Kermit Ninja. Welcome, Daniel Ucchio. Welcome, Michael Ladson. Longtime friend Michael Ladson. Great guy. Lots we're going to talk about here on YouTube Live, so take the opportunity to send out a tweet, put out an announcement on your Facebook wall. It's Saturday afternoon. I'm here. I'm about to stock up on that beverage that will not be named, diet soda. Won't say what it is, right? No product placement here. I'm just pouring it into my glass. Plenty to talk about today. Anxious to talk about whatever is on people's minds, questions. But one thing that I've been thinking about that's been on my mind lately, I was walking around the neighborhood earlier today out here in Bay Ridge, and I was talking to people. You know, there was this candidate, this guy who ran for office, ran for governor of New York State in 2010. Everyone loved him. He was the rent is too damn high guy. I think people will remember that. That was the name of his political party that was on the ballot. He called himself the Rent is Too Damn High. And at the time, you know, I was around a political organization. We were supporting Charles Barron, the anti-imperialist candidate, you know, who was running on the Freedom Party ticket. And so we all thought that the rent is too damn high guy might be some kind of conspiracy, because it just seemed like out of the blue. No one had heard this guy. He went viral, and then no one heard about Charles Barron. But what he was hinting at about the rent is too damn high, just finishing up, conversation starts now. All right, but we all thought that rent is too damn high guy was some kind of conspiracy. But what he was getting at, interestingly, and I have no evidence of that. I'm not saying that it was a conspiracy at all. I'm just telling you that was the kind of conversations we were having in this political group. You know, what was he getting at was the fact that we have a problem, which is that in urban centers around the world, real estate prices are no longer tied in with actually renting to people. That's the problem, is that real estate speculation is the new casino. It's the new stock market, where basically you've got real estate conglomerates, giant corporations that own property all over the world. They buy a property, they wait for the property values to go up, maybe they fix up the building, maybe they wait for gentrification, whatever happens. They then sell the building and they make huge amounts of money. And at no point do they ever need people to actually rent the apartments. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of apartments in New York City that no one lives in, and that the real estate speculation has made it so landlords don't actually have to rent the apartments. They can make a profit. They can make a profit through having apartment buildings that nobody ever lives in, right? Real estate speculation. Now, President Xi of China, he very famously came forward recently in China and he said, housing is for living in, not for speculation. And he's saying, look, we have housing in China so people can live in it, and they are having all kinds of laws now to curb real estate speculation, which was becoming a problem in China's urban centers. So we see President Xi addressing it. When are our government officials over here going to come forward and say, housing is for living in, not for speculation, right? When are they going to take that stand? Because that's the reality. That's the problem with capitalism, is under capitalism we have production according to profits, not according to need. Sellability, not usability, right? Houses are made so that landlords and bankers can make profits, not so people can live in them. Food is not produced so people can eat it. Food is produced rather so that agribusiness and big corporations and big box stores can make money selling it. And capitalism is the only system in the world where people are homeless because there are too many houses and too many housing units. People are hungry because there is too much food. In systems of the past, people starved because there wasn't enough food. Under capitalism, people starve because there is too much food. Under capitalism, people are homeless because there is too much housing. Capitalism is a deeply irrational system, and its irrationality can be resolved by the banks, factories, and industries, major centers of economic power, being taken under the control of the people. Socialism is the public control of the economy in which the working class people have control of economic power. Wow, what is going on? And yes, Kermit says, you are an addict to diet soda, if ever. I am totally addicted to this. Interestingly, so is President Donald Trump. Now, I understand he drinks roughly 12 cans of this beverage that I love to consume every day. I don't drink that many, right? The most I've ever done is maybe 10, and that's on a really bad day where I'm just really, really tired and having to stay at work for hours and all of that. So, yes, so apparently, you know, being addicted to diet soda that will not be named is something that very, very commonly takes place. You can be quite successful. Good old quote from Frederick Engels, says Komsomol. He must be a regular viewer. One of my favorite quotations from Frederick Engels. Under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Yes, that is the quote. Or I like to quote Mao Zedong, the founder of the People's Republic of China. He very famously said, "Profits are in command. Profits are in command. The rule of the dollar." That is what capitalism is. Capitalism is not people having lots of money. Capitalism is not people being creative and starting their own businesses. Capitalism is the rule of profits. It's when society is organized to serve profits and the human needs of the population are left behind. And socialism is when the state steps in and intervenes on behalf of the population. A lot to talk about today. I will say, you know, I like to read the Wall Street Journal, and that the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal is often, the best. It gives you, instead of giving you specific news stories, it gives you kind of roundup. It points to overall trends. The weekend review of the Wall Street Journal today. Very interesting. Take a look at this. The driverless revolution. The driverless revolution. They're talking about how we may get to the point of driverless cars. Driverless cars, folks. Now think about what that will mean. All the truck drivers out of a job. All the cab drivers out of a job. All the Uber drivers out of a job. This is capitalism eliminating labor like you have never heard of before, right? This is machines replacing people. Workers' competition with machines. Driving over production. This is the reality. This is what Karl Marx wrote about in his book, Capital. It's happening, right? The bosses do not need workers. The means of production have advanced to the point that industrial labor is being eliminated, and millions are being left without a place at the global assembly line. This is the reality that Karl Marx wrote about. It's happening before our very eyes. Capitalism is creating a class of people who really have no place, right? Millions of people are being cast out. The means of production function now in the aftermath of the computer revolution without workers. The industrial worker is being eliminated. Meanwhile, an economy that continues to churn out products, huge amounts of products being churned out more efficiently than ever before. Look at Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. Look at him. Look at the conditions people are working in these sweatshops around the country. Bernie Sanders is talking about it. Donald Trump has even talked about it. Across the world, we see strikes in the stock facilities owned by Amazon. This is the reality of a low-wage, global capitalist economy and the rising alternative in Eurasia. Crazy things are happening in the world. The job market is changing, says Nevermind. Well, I'm not going to never mind that, I'll tell you that much. But anyway, I'm going to tone it down here and sound a little bit less like a morning shock jock. I'm just fired up because it is quite a day. I'm here in my Brooklyn apartment. I will take my first sip of that unnamed beverage, which I think you all can guess what it is. A lot to talk about. A lot to talk about. But don't forget to tweet this out and get people involved in the conversation. Dylan Newton says, build libertarian socialism. What's going on? Juan Batusta says, the CFA Frank. Speculation is called investment in capitalism. What's going on? Good day, Caleb says, proletarian guard. What's happening here? What a day. What is going on here? Now, we're enjoying ourselves here. Now, The China lobby. I wanted to talk about this. Now, if anyone's familiar with U.S. history in the 1950s, they'll know that one of the main groups that drove McCarthyism was what they called the China lobby. And these were folks that were tied in with the brutal dictator of it was the guy who killed lots of communists on the mainland, then eventually fled to Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, right? And the KMT, Nationalist Party of China, started out as a progressive revolutionary group led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, aligned with communists. After Sun Yat-sen died, you had the coup by Chiang Kai-shek, and eventually fleeing to Taiwan. And that the rallying cry of the McCarthyists, Joe McCarthy, and the rallying cry of really the Republicans who were attacking the Democrats was, who lost China? And it was essentially that China had become communist on the watch of Harry Truman, and that this showed that the Democrats were a bunch of sellouts and communists. You had the old China lobby that they called it, people like the KMT, Nationalist Party in China. You had the, different forces, religious fanatics, others that had fled the mainland, and that they were kind of the center of McCarthyism. That was the China lobby, and that liberals and progressives hated the China lobby. They talked about the China lobby being extremists. There was something called the World Anti-Communist League, and that the China lobby was just something that progressive people loathed. They loathed the China lobby. Well, folks, the China lobby is back. This time it's being led by Peter Navarro and Tim Leitheiser and the Falun Gong and the Falun Dafa. And the White House has fallen into the pocket of a group of anti-China extremists, fanatics who hate the People's Republic of China, not because they want to make America great again, not because they care about American workers. They are driven by ideological anti-communism, contempt, blood feud, revenge desires against the People's Republic. Do people know who the Falun Gong is, or the Falun Dafa? This is quite a fanatical organization. I encourage you to just look them up. Read about this group. They put out a newspaper here in New York City called the Epoch Times, and they accuse the Chinese Communist Party of harvesting organs, all kinds of crazy, extreme allegations that the World Health Organization and the United Nations has investigated and disproven time and time again. The Falun Gong, the Falun Dafa, this is a religious fanatical cult. They are dedicated to some mystical practices, traditional Chinese medicine, superstition. The group is opposed to interracial dating. They believe if you are interracial, if your parents are of a different race, then you have no soul. They are very opposed to homosexuality. They are very opposed to women participating in government. They think the fact that women can vote all over the world is proof that we are in what they call a Dharma-ending period. This is a group of people that glorify and romanticize Chinese feudalism. The leader of the group, he lives in Queens, New York, millionaire, billionaire, very, very wealthy. It's a fanatical cult, and for a long time, the Falun Gong, or the Falun Dafa, were aligning themselves with liberals, right? Because they present themselves as kind of a mystical exercise society. It's a way to be healthy and do all these weird exercises and stimulate the chi or the magical wheel in your stomach. It's kind of a hippie, Eastern kind of thing. But now, it seems like Falun Gong, Falun Dafa is aligning itself with Team Trump. They have been at Trump rallies, inside of Trump rallies, distributing leaflets saying, subscribe to Epoch Times, exposing communism daily. They've been running articles by the complete, ridiculous, laughable, anti-communist hack, Trevor Loudon. And it appears that Team Trump, which, Trump was talking about negotiating with China, maybe even working with China to rebuild our infrastructure, getting Chinese corporations more invested, it seems that Team Trump has doubled down. And Tim Leitheiser, Peter Navarro, Falun Dafa, Falun Gong, all the anti-China fanatics, the DPP in Taiwan, a fanatical anti-Chinese party in Taiwan, all of them are lining up behind the White House. The White House is in with the China lobby. The China lobby of the McCarthy era is back. And these folks who don't want to make America great again, they don't want to make our economy better, they don't want to help American workers, they just hate the People's Republic of China, the group that's raised 700 million people out of poverty and is building hospitals and schools all over the world, that is improving life in Africa, Asia, Latin America. They hate China with a passion and are dedicated to bringing it down. And it seems that the White House has pivoted into an alliance with the China lobby. And this is not a good sign. Now, I say that these folks don't really care about American workers because I just met with my family from Ohio. I sit down with my family from Ohio every so often. Folks know that I'm from there. In Ohio, we grow something called soybeans, right? If you're somebody who likes to drink chai latte and healthy food, you consume a lot of soybeans. In Ohio, there are a lot of soybean farmers, and those soybean farmers are furious because no one's buying their soybeans. We already had Barack Obama who said to the soybean farmers that they could no longer export their soybeans to Russia. He put agricultural sanctions on Russia. So soybean farmers could not sell to Russia, which they've been selling to in big numbers since the fall of the Soviet Union. And now Trump comes along, and he was saying, oh my gosh, I'm going to sign deals, and China's going to buy beef. This is going to be a huge... all the farm products American farmers are going to sell to China. Well, forget about that, folks. Trump ruined that. Right? These tariffs have now ended. Ended what was the hope, not just in Ohio, but in Iowa, in Kentucky, in Missouri, in Kansas. All the Farm Belt states were so excited about selling farm products to China. The farm glut was going to end. The price of agricultural products like milk and beef and corn, it was going to start rising again. Nope, 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 nope. Right? The Farm Belt is suffering because Tim Leitheiser, Peter Navarro, anti-China agitators, the Falun Dafa Gong, whatever they're called, the people that think we've got magical wheels in our tummies and that China is, I mean, these fanatics, right, these anti-China fanatics have tied themselves to the White House. The White House is working closely with the anti-China lobby, and it's hurting American jobs and American workers. This is not good. This is not good at all. So there we go. But what else have we got going on in the chat? Marx said, powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Speaking of communism, this is Simon Lawrenson. Today it is much more than just Europe, but this quote still trans true. Yes, except the weirdest thing is it's not ideological communism that they are opposed to. That's what's different than the Cold War. A lot of the forces that have state-run and centrally planned economies no longer espouse like radical Marxism, right? A lot of times the forces around the world that are developing economies that are controlled by the people and building up independent economies, trading, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, part of the Eurasian Bloc or the Eurasian Economic Union. A lot of these independent economies that are emerging around the world, the Bolivarians, the Syrians, the Iranians, a lot of them don't espouse, they're not trying, I mean, none of them, I should say, not a lot of them, none of them are trying to espouse or spread communist revolution around the world. That's not what they're about, right? These people just want what's good for their country and their people. And they know that in order to do that, they need an economy that serves public good and not profits. And, whether they come at it in a Bolivarian way, the Bolivarians are very much rooted in their traditional culture of Latin America. They're very much Marxist influenced. They're also very Roman Catholic and Christian. You've got the Shia Muslims in Iran. You've got Ba'athist Arab socialism in Syria. You've got the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics. You've got different forces around the world that are building up planned economies. They're not trying to spread a revolution, right? This isn't 1970. There's no Communist International. This isn't, no one's storming the barricades. There's no Red Menace. This is just countries around the world saying, look, we want to organize the economy to serve ourselves and public good, not Wall Street profits. We've got oil here. We're going to control our oil. We've got steel mills here. We are going to control our steel mills. We are going to make the economy work in the interests of our own country, not in the interests of Wall Street and London and these billionaire global financial elites that are driving the world further into poverty so that they can stay rich. It's crazy. It's a crazy time that we're living in here. Wall Street is basically at the point they don't need industrial workers anymore, right? They are eliminating jobs with technology, and the same kind of things that they've done to Africa and Asia and Latin America, where they keep these countries chronically poor as captive spheres of influence, they're starting to do it to the first world now. First world countries are being lowered to third world conditions so that Wall Street can continue to rake in super profits at the expense of humanity. This is a crazy time we're living in, and if you want to understand what's going on, you have to understand economics, right? People want to talk about, lizard people and the thing high up on the thing and the Illuminati and all this crazy stuff. Turn to economics. If you want to understand the world, start talking about economics, because this is political economy in action. There is an underlying force. Look at all the countries the United States is opposing around the world. Venezuela, what do they have? They have an independent state-run oil company that is selling oil on the international markets in competition with Wall Street? Why do they hate Russia? Russia's economy is centered around two gigantic state-run independent oil and an oil company, Rosneft, Gazprom, a giant state-run natural gas company, and they can't stand it. Wall Street and London hate having to compete, and they're furious that the Germans are going to start importing natural gas from Russia. They're furious about Nord Stream 2, the pipeline, right? This is what Wall Street wants. They want the world to stay poor and dependent and buy everything from them. They want the globe as one giant sphere of influence, one giant captive market for the billionaires that run the world. And countries all around the world, whether they're socialists, nationalists, Christians, Muslims, Bolivarians, whatever they are, they're saying we don't want this. We are going to control our economy. And increasingly, in the United States, millions of people are starting to say it's about time we controlled our economy here. Right? We got the rise of Ocasio-Cortez. We got the rise of Bernie Sanders. We got millions of young people that say that they like socialism better than capitalism. This is an interesting time that we are living in. Capitalism is having its end game. It's having a meltdown on the global stage because it's advancing technology at the expense of humanity. Wow, folks, I have a lot of energy today. I'll drink another thing. Now, Alaska has a state oil company. How about North Dakota with its state bank, says Bird Worldist. Well, that's very interesting. Now, a lot of people, and that was interesting, if you noticed, Cornel West and other people actually praised Sarah Palin for the fact that she was allowing oil proceeds from Alaska to go to the population. But the state functions in Alaska kind of like a middleman, right? It's really American big oil companies, ExxonMobil, some of the smaller, Noble Energy, others. They're in there in Alaska. They're making profits. But the state of Alaska is kind of functioning as a middleman. And because Alaska has such a small population, and we saw it was actually a conservative, Sarah Palin, who made sure that some of the proceeds from selling Alaska's oil resources actually went into the pockets of the people of the state. So in a way, Sarah Palin did a progressive thing when she allowed people in Alaska to actually receive a check in the mail, the proceeds of their natural resources. So there you go. There's an element of truth in that. North Dakota has a state bank that they set up. I believe it was set up during the Great Depression. And you see kind of Bonapartist maneuvers like that when sections of the ruling class are fighting with each other. But at the end of the day, all of that is done to serve capital. But you go to Venezuela, that giant state-run oil company, that's not a middleman. It serves public good. And the private companies there and the wealthy people there would like it to go away. They don't just see it as a middleman that works on their behalf. But that's very interesting. That's a very interesting conversation. Now, Proletarian Guard says, I'm not a trot. I'm just asking a question. Well, you know what, folks? I don't, I've read Trotsky. I've studied Trotsky. I don't like Trotsky. I think that he played mostly a negative role throughout his life. But you should study Trotsky. You can learn a lot from it. I mean, Trotsky, the interesting thing about reading Trotsky's writings is that Trotsky is mainly, especially in the time after his exile, he's very, very critical of the Soviet Union and its leadership. And he's saying very negative things about them and all that, but he's able to point things out that the Soviet Union didn't have the luxury of pointing out. Right? That he's able to point out different trends. He criticizes the Popular Front. He criticizes the United Front from below. And he's able to say things that when the Soviet Union is just trying to kind of run their country and lead the world communist movement, they're not going to come out and say. They have to be very, very careful what they say as they're leading a movement. Trotsky is just this critic who's writing essays on the sidelines, and he's able to say things that are quite different from that. And so it's useful to read him. However, the big flaw in Trotsky's logic is that there's two things. First of all, if you read Trotsky, the main thing that you get out of it is he seems to think that there's a magical formula. There's like a one-size-fits-all solution. If everyone does exactly what the Bolsheviks did in July or August of 1917, if one does that in all situations at all times, everything just works out fine. And that's absurd. Different tactics in different situations. And his whole critique of Communist International and their activities is based on, they're not doing what Lenin did in July of 1917. And that's ridiculous. There are different tactics in different circumstances. The other aspect of Trotsky that I must say is the more you read Trotsky, the more you can tell that he was very much tied in with European social democracy. He saw his ideas as very much, he considered himself to be aligned with Lenin and the Bolsheviks, but at the end of the day, he saw himself as part of European social democracy and part of this kind of revolutionary current in Europe. And that when Lenin built the party of a new type, which was a completely new political formation, something that had never been done before. When Lenin did that, when Lenin basically declared that the Second International was a stinking corpse and broke ties with all these European social democratic parties, Trotsky was never really comfortable with that. Trotsky saw himself as the radical wing of European social democracy, and that his followers, in a lot of ways, they turned to Trotsky because they didn't like the fact that the Soviet Union was not European. It was not an outpost of European liberalism. It wasn't people in bars who wanted freedom and thought the French Revolution didn't go far enough. You know, that Trotskyism was based on kind of a level of frustration that Western European intellectuals had with the Russian Revolution, that the Russian Revolution was very Russian. And in Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he wrote about how the revolutionary energy was going to be coming from the East, and how it was going to be people in the developing world in that epoch who were going to create socialism. And that in order to create the Russian Revolution, Lenin built a party of a new type, which all these European social democrats said, look, this is like, you know, they looked at the Bolsheviks and how Lenin was saying that they give the whole of their lives and they march as one with democratic centralism. And European social democrats were looking at the party of a new type and saying that this was like a monastic order, this is like some kind of secret society, this is not a revolutionary, a social democratic organization. And it wasn't. The Party of a New Type was something that was rooted in Russia's unique history. If you read about the Old Believers, if you read about the Decembrists, right? When Lenin built the Party of a New Type, a kind of revolutionary conspiracy to seize control of the society, that was rooted in Russia's unique conditions. It was very much like a lot of different secret societies and organizations where people swore and took oaths and gave the whole of their lives. It was a very Russian institution. And Trotsky was opposed to it. The famous August Bloc, he opposed it. And that Trotsky was very much, he believed in European social democracy, and he wasn't exactly comfortable with how Lenin took socialism and applied Russian characteristics to it. And Trotsky, in a lot of ways, you could say Trotsky was kind of a self-hating Russian. Trotsky really hated the peasantry. He thought that peasants were ignorant, backward fools. Lenin called for a revolutionary government of the workers and peasants. Trotsky insisted only the workers, not the peasants. And if you look at Russia at that point, it was like a 90% peasant country. So to not want to have a revolutionary government of the peasantry just didn't make any sense. It would be just kind of a foolish thing to do. But that's where Trotsky was at. And that Trotsky, in a lot of ways, he was clinging to, Marxism. Karl Marx. Marxism itself originated in the aftermath of the overthrow of feudalism. Karl Marx and others had participated in revolutionary uprisings in Germany and France and elsewhere. They brought down old kings, they were fighting for human rights and freedom, and they represented a strata within the revolutions that brought down feudalism in Europe that said it didn't go far enough. And they were still rooted in the ideals of those revolutions that created capitalism and the Republican form of government in Europe. And Trotsky was very much stuck in that. And Lenin, when he came along and developed Bolshevism, he was essentially building, calling for socialism with Russian characteristics. Not completely. He still believed in dialectical materialism, and he was not a supporter of Christianity, didn't believe in religion. However, he adopted the Marxist ideas for Russia's unique conditions. He developed the theory of imperialism, and all of that was stuff that Trotsky was not really comfortable with, and that comes across. And then with the rise of Stalin, where Stalin develops, what people call really existing socialism with 5-year plans, with the rule of one party, the economic model that kind of defined the Cold War was very much a break with what, Karl Marx and the people in Europe thought they were fighting for. And all of them thought Europe would be the center of world revolution. And Lenin, with his theory of imperialism, explained why that would not be the case. But anyway, this might be a lot of inside baseball to folks. I don't know if people all want to hear this. I should get back into something a little more widespread, but, Now, Bird Worldist says Trotsky helped us usher in the neocons. Well, there's an element of truth in that. A lot of the neoconservatives were people that were socialists who broke with the global communist movement, and then in the 50s they became, even more conservative, and by the 60s and 70s they were conservative. People like Irving Kristol, Gene Kirkpatrick, who else? Others. I mean, and that the neoconservative faction, which is just marketing. There's all this stuff about neocons. I'm going to take another drink of this soda that will not be named. Diet soda, but no product placement here. Let's talk about neocons. So what is a neoconservative, right? It's very interesting. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, and the people talk about, well, there's the neocon faction. Neocons. What is a neoconservative? Basically, during the Cold War, the Republican Party adopted its message. And that's really what neoconservatism is, right? So during the Cold War, at the beginning of the Cold War, you had McCarthyism, and Republicans accusing Democrats of being communists. So the Democrats are a bunch of traitors and communists and sellouts, and we want real capitalism. You had, very famously, Taft, who was kind of a big voice in the Republican Party, who was the author of the Taft-Hartley anti-labor law, which hurts labor unions. Taft, very famously, he was opposed to a lot of military interventions around the world, and he held on to this kind of like small government. He was more like libertarian, right? And you had figures like Barry Goldwater that emerged, and the John Birch Society, and they were accusing communists of poisoning the water, and it was like the Republican Party was almost like a stronghold of like small businessmen who thought that like Wall Street was communist, and their alienation from U.S. society was expressed in this kind of radical anti-communism. And it was very easy to make fun of. And, Barry Goldwater lost the 1964 presidential election with his campaign ad basically saying, look, the Republicans are such extremists. If they come to power, we're going to have nuclear war. Vote for Lyndon Johnson. He's not a nut. He doesn't think your drinking water is being poisoned by communists. And so the Republican Party, because they were so fanatically anti-communist, and they were anti-communist to the point that they were actually, they were like clashing with a lot of powerful institutions in the United States. They wanted the USA to pull out of the United Nations, for example, and that the Republican Party was very much fringe right-wing, and that it wasn't a winning formula. The American public didn't want to hear it. After the McCarthy era, it was kind of dying. So when Richard Nixon was running for president in 1968, you had the Democrats split, because at that point the Democrats were supporting the Civil Rights Movement, and they had passed the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and other things. So in the Democratic Party, you had the American Independence Party that split. George Wallace, not to be confused with Henry Wallace the Progressive, but George Wallace, this southern racist governor, he splits the Democratic Party vote, and he runs on a platform of he wants segregation. George Wallace, very famous, right? So Nixon is running for president as a Republican, and Nixon's advisors started studying the rhetoric of George Wallace, and they discovered that George Wallace had a brilliant, brilliant way of speaking to the U.S. public and getting kind of support in small towns, rural areas. And what George Wallace basically did is, he focused on he was for the average Joe, he was for ordinary guys, but ordinary guys hate hippies. That was kind of his thing. In George Wallace, he very famously said that, the only four-letter words that young anti-war activists don't like are SOAP and WORK. And George Wallace developed this strategy of speaking where it was kind of like he was for the ordinary working man who's a conservative, right? I'm for the ordinary working man who supports the war in Vietnam. I'm for the ordinary working man who's tired of these hippies and they all need to get a job. I'm for the ordinary working man who hates feminism. And it was this kind of like populism, and it was directed at kind of American industrial workers and others, but it was conservative, and that this conservative populism was a winning formula. So over the course of the 1968 presidential campaign, Richard Nixon is getting advised by conservatives, and they increasingly have him start to adopt the rhetoric of George Wallace. And people talk about what they call the Southern strategy, whereas, George Wallace was pretty blatantly racist. So Nixon, people aren't going to vote for him if they can call him racist. So instead of saying blatantly racist things, he says things that are what people like to call code words, right? Richard Nixon famously says he's opposed to forced busing. Forced busing. He says, I'm opposed to forced busing, right? Well, what that meant was in urban areas where they were integrating the schools and they were desegregating the schools, that meant he was opposed to your children having to go to school with people of another race. But he didn't say that. If he said that, he would be a racist. So he said, I'm opposed to forced busing. He very famously, Nixon would say things that were interpreted as he could say he wasn't racist, but to racists it meant, he's on our team. And that was kind of the strategy. And then the other thing was he would accuse it was kind of like Nixon, very famously, he was somewhat of an economic populist. It was like not focusing on economic issues was the main overall thrust, right? Being a conservative is not about, being a radical free marketeer. It's about supporting wars and military interventions and hating the communists, about being loyal to the country and being culturally conservative, right? And that was kind of the neocon formulation. And then you have Dr. Strauss, Leo Strauss, the philosophy teacher, you have Irving Kristol, and others, and they developed kind of a messaging strategy for Republicans that kind of turns around, right? during the 60s, the people that were winning the elections were like John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and they were like social liberals who wanted to negotiate with the Soviet Union. And the Republicans basically turned it around with this new formulation that, I mean, I think like Rupert Murdoch's TV and Bill O'Reilly kind of stuff. I'm for the average Joe, and liberals are a bunch of cultural elites who don't understand the working man, and, you know, the trader, the people, the left are all a bunch of commies who hate America, and, you know, it was a specific formulation that worked, and it's based on having a huge strata of, like, middle-class white workers in the United States who are comfortable, and it's based on that, and that was neoconservatism, and it was a winning strategy, and you had, like, the rise of, like, what they called the Sovietologists. These people would go to Harvard and Yale, and they would study Sovietology, which was basically just anti-communism. They'd get a degree in anti-communism, and then they'd get appointed in the government. Sovietology, right? And that these Sovietology schools were tied into the Republican Party, and Leo Strauss, he was called Dr. Leo Strauss, and Irving Kristol, and these kind of conservative strategists. Irving Kristol had been a Trotskyist at one point, and he became a right-winger, and others. And they developed kind of this method of, of kind of messaging the Republican Party and kind of reframing conservatism away from the John Birch Society stuff and more in line with the, just this kind of Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, we're spreading freedom around the world. I know Leo Strauss very famously said that his favorite TV show was an old Western called Gunsmoke. I don't know if people... maybe you see it on old TV, Gunsmoke. And it's like a Western where the good guy wears a white hat, the bad guy wears a black hat. Very clear, no question of who's good and bad. Everything is, very simple. The good guy always wins, the bad guy always loses. The bad guy is all bad, the good guy is all good. And Leo Strauss argued that that's how Americans should look at world politics. They should see politics like an episode of Gunsmoke. Right? And if you'll watch Reagan, I mean, when Reagan would get on TV and he'd be like, the communists have taken him down, it was effective, and the Sandinistas and Nicaragua and Contra Aid, and it was kind of like neoconservatism was a way that Republicans could win by dropping like libertarian or paleoconservative or hard right politics and adopting this kind of my country right or wrong, if you don't like it here, why don't you move to another country? Economics, what's economics? I don't know what economics is, but don't you hate forced busing, and don't you hate welfare mothers? That was what neoconservatism was as a political tactic. And it worked for the Republicans up until the Bush years, and it died pretty badly during the Bush years. Bush was kind of the last hurrah of neoconservatism. Trump is not a neoconservative at all. It's completely different. It's actually it's got elements of that whole of that old paleoconservatism. It's got elements of kind of populism. The Trump administration is new for the Republican Party, and the Trump Republicans don't like what they call the neocon Republicans. And the neocon Republicans are people like Marco Rubio that are sticking to this this kind of simple messaging, avoiding economics, avoiding any real avoiding any like conservative principles, focusing on just hating enemies of the United States. The neoconservative messaging strategy just doesn't work. Your average rank-and-file Republican in the aftermath of the fall of the 2008 financial crisis and the continuing fallout, at this point, your average rank-and-file Republican just doesn't think like a neocon does. I remember during the debates, folks, I'll tell you this. I hate to get personal, but people like it when you tell stories. I remember, during the debates, Jeb Bush was debating Trump. And Jeb Bush very famously, he was debating Donald Trump, and Trump turns to Jeb Bush and says, Jeb, your brother, he lied us into a war. There were no weapons of mass destruction. And Donald Trump eventually, this was in a Republican debate. He won and he's now the president of the United States. A Republican president says what I was telling my classmates back in Ohio in 2002, 2003, and everyone thought I was crazy. Right? And now all these Republicans are telling me I was a traitor for not supporting the war, that Saddam Hussein was a member of Al-Qaeda in 9/11, and we should all be... Now the Republican candidate, the one that all the Republicans voted for, basically agrees with what Michael Moore was saying in 2002, 2003. That's big, and that's a shift, and that shows the Republican Party has changed. The Republican Party is no longer the party of my country right or wrong. If you don't like it here, why don't you move to some other place? Now Republicans are talking about the deep state, and they're talking about, international corporations, and, and the Republicans have moved into the kind of politics, a lot of this Barry Goldwater kind of stuff, but also some other hard right kind of stuff. The Republican Party has shifted, and that neoconservatism just doesn't work anymore. Neoconservatism is based on, this kind of don't fix it if it ain't broke. This is the greatest country in the world. Shut your mouth if you've got a problem. And most Republicans are in areas that have big problems now, with low wages, with the end of industrial jobs, with opioids. And so this kind of messaging, this strategy of messaging that everything's okay, and if you're a protester or you think the government's corrupt and all of that, you're an idiot and you need to move to another country, that just doesn't work for Republicans anymore. That's basically what neoconservatism is. It was a political messaging strategy developed during the Cold War. It was very, very effective. It survived up into the 90s, the Bush years. It's dead now. Neoconservatism is dead. Neoconservatism is dead, and the Republican Party is moving into kind of a right-wing Bonapartist field, just like the Democrats are moving into kind of a social democratic field. I mean, it's changing. Politics is changing. And really, people want to say, well, oh my God, we're heading to some sort of revolutionary crisis. No, this is the USA getting to normal. We're getting back to normal. Most countries in the world, you have an extreme right and an extreme left, right? You have your Bernie Sanders types, you have your Donald Trump types. That's just normal politics in most of the world. But U.S. politics from the end of the Second World War up until like the Bush years was defined by having such a huge middle class and having so many people that were so comfortable. And it was based on having such a huge middle class that politics did not have to get extreme, that people didn't think about political ideas with any depth. There was like no ideology whatsoever. People voted for the candidate who had the cutest dog or made the funniest joke they would like to have a beer with, and most people were just completely depoliticized. Well, now Americans are getting more politicized than they've ever been in my lifetime. People across America, they are getting interested in politics because there are issues that they really, really care about. Now, they're not all becoming left. A lot of them are becoming right, But, Americans are being forced to become political by the unique historical circumstances that we're living under here in 2018. And people say, oh, everything's great, the economy is booming. Well, unemployment is down, but the situation, the low-wage service sector jobs, look at these sweatshops Jeff Bezos is running. We're living in quite interesting times here. But what else is going on here? I want to catch up on the comments people are making here. What's going on? Kaninki says, was Obama a neocon? He hired Victoria Nuland. Well, that's where it gets weird. Now, we understand Victoria Nuland comes out of that Sovietology milieu. She went to college to study, anti-communism. And that a lot of the forces that kind of became prominent voices in U.S. politics, especially in Eastern Europe, right? And Victoria Nuland, let's remember that she was in Ukraine. I mean, that was her role, is that she was, and people that specialized in Eastern Europe, they were coming up in the 80s, they were studying Russia, they were studying Eastern European economies, and they were Sovietologists, and they were tied in with the neocons. And the Democrats appointed them, and the Republicans appointed them, and that's more the field that they were working in. If you were going to be appointed into the U.S. diplomatic corps in the 90s, that meant you had gone to school in the 80s, and you'd been around Leo Strauss, and you'd been around Irving Kristol, and you had studied that kind of thinking. The Sovietology, neoconservative kind of school of messaging that we're against the communists, and it's kind of all about opposing the left and not really focusing on economics and just this kind of like my country right or wrong, kind of the things you read in the Wall Street Journal by their Latin America columnist McGrady or whatever her name is. It's just this kind of like silly fanatical anti-communism. That's kind of what all these folks got trained in, and it's kind of it's a unique form of thinking that people talk about, and that's really, you're going to get a neocon. Yes, Obama did appoint him, and I mean, to be fair, let's be fair, so did the Clinton administration. They appointed a lot of neocons to run their role in Eastern Europe especially, but they had ties with a lot of these neoconservative strategists. But neoconservatism was a political messaging strategy the Republicans developed, and they developed it during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it was a winning strategy for them during the Cold War. So that's my rant about neoconservatism. Wow, Kaniki. Okay, thank you for telling me how to correctly pronounce your name. You are Kaniki, and Kaninki, and I will call you that from now on. Thank you very much. But yeah, so both parties are really switching their messaging strategy. Now, folks, a little bit later in the live, people have recommended, they said, is there an audio book of Getting Rich Without Capitalism available? People have asked me that. I actually had the idea, and I think I might do this a little later in the live. I'm actually going to read to you from the introduction of this book. I'm going to read you the introduction. Not the whole thing, just a section from the introduction of this book, and that'll be kind of the beginning of an audio book. So I'm going to do that a little bit later for folks and see what people think, because I think it'll interest you. But that's my book, Getting Rich Without Capitalism. continue to get good reviews on Amazon, continues to sell. Every time I get on there, I see another copy of it being sold. I mean, it strikes a chord. It's a kind of socialism you don't hear. It's not you know, kind of liberal pandering. It's certainly not right-wing stuff, but it's also it's kind of unique, and it's based on, you know, my understanding of the world, which is Marxism, which is based in, you know, kind of an understanding of the world that is scientific and based in economics, not based in cultural understanding, and not based in just kind of this primitive stuff, this primitive feel-good politics that we have passing for leftism in the world today. I'm just spelling out your mispronunciation, says Kaninki. Oh my goodness, my hair is very Kaninki. Oh wow. Oh, okay, so it's kinky. I'll just say kinky. How's that? I'll say kinky from now on. I'm sorry. You were spelling out my mispronunciation. Well, there you go. All right, so is Xi Jinping's governance of China worth reading? Absolutely. It is absolutely worth reading. I wrote an article about it, went up on China.org. President Xi Jinping's governance of China is brilliant. I mean, and it gets back to the science of statecraft. You know, people ask me, I mean, why is it that I'm praising President Xi's writing? If you read it, okay, so, you know, during the Dark Ages, what people call the Dark Ages in Europe, there was a feeling that people existed simply to serve those who ruled over them, right? If you were a peasant, you existed to serve the person who owned the land. Commoners existed to serve the king. And that was it. You know, you served your quote-unquote natural superiors, right? That's what human existence was defined by. But what defined the Renaissance and what really brought us, you know, the modern world was there was a shift in thinking. In Italy, in Britain with the Tudor monarchy and elsewhere, there started to be a feeling that the government had an obligation to improve the lives of the population. That it wasn't just a one-way relationship. The people didn't exist simply to serve the rulers. The rulers had an obligation to the people. And that's like a new shift that you saw. And based on that, you saw the creation of the first public education created by the Tudor monarchy. You saw, you know, Italian leaders starting to promote like Leonardo da Vinci. And you saw the funding of scientific research for the first time. And that was all based on this new breakthrough in understanding that the government has an obligation to rule in a way that is to the benefit of the population. And what that's called, the actual technical term for that style of thinking that emerged in the Renaissance, is called statecraft. That's statecraft. I know it sounds, when I say it, some people, they just get this authoritarian chill. They're like, oh my God, statecraft. No, statecraft is the idea that the government should rule in a way that benefits you. That your existence, it's not just that you should serve the government, but the government should serve you. And ultimately, statecraft led to the scientific breakthroughs that eventually led to the overthrow of feudalism, the concept of democracy, right? Government of the people, the Republican form of government, all of that emerged from that breakthrough. And the weirdest thing is that in Western capitalism, we've gotten away from the concept of statecraft. We've gotten to the point that we want leaders who lead by, making us feel good about ourselves, by putting down their opponents, by holding off. They say, oh, if the other guy wins, the world will burst into flames and we'll all go to death camps and it'll be the end of the world. Oh my God. So we vote for people that are going to hold off the apocalypse. But in Russia, I've seen it myself. In China, in a lot of countries around the world, statecraft is reemerging. And it's this idea that our political leaders, they don't have to be our friends, right? If I was really sick, say I had a tumor, and I needed someone to cut the tumor out of me, and I was picking a doctor. When I pick a doctor, I'd be like, okay, this doctor. Now, do you have a cute dog? Is your dog really, really cute? Would I want to go hang out with you and have a beer? And you're not a nerd, are you? You're not a nerd, right? You don't stay up all night reading books about medical stuff, right? Are you just a cool guy that I would like? Are you going to be Mr. Pop? That's not what I would want in a doctor, right? I wouldn't want a doctor who was a cool guy who had a cute dog. I would want a doctor who was a fanatical doctor. I would want a doctor that was totally all about getting that tumor out of me. I'd want him to have straight A's from medical school. I would want to have the best doctor I could have, and I wouldn't care if he was, the coolest guy and was hip and had a cute dog and his family. I would care about how damn good he was at being a doctor, how good he was at getting the job done, right? And that used to be the attitude that people had about governments, right? That governments were based on how well they could get the job done, right? wasn't whether you liked them or not. It wasn't whether they were cool guys and hip, and that wasn't what it was about. Statecraft was a science, you know? A guy is a good doctor, he gets the job done as a doctor. A guy is a good basket weaver, he weaves really good baskets. Well, statecraft was the idea that someone is a good leader of the government if the standard of living of the population increases, life gets better, and people see more happiness in their lives. That's what statecraft was about. President Xi Jinping is a brilliant statesman or a statesperson. He is living out and carrying out statecraft in the 21st century. And if you read The Governance of China, you are reading someone who has studied the science of statecraft. Not just, I mean, he's an expert on Marxism. There's a whole section on Marxism and socialism with Chinese characteristics and Mao and all these very, very important, you know, breakthroughs of Chinese communism. But he also talks about Confucianism. He talks about the One Belt, One Road initiative. He talks about the need for sustainable development and ecology and the danger of global warming. You read The Governance of China. This is an expert statesman. This is somebody who has studied in universities, who's spent his whole life being vetted by the Chinese Communist Party. He's brilliant. In China, they call him the big boss. And when you read The Governance of China, the book he put out, you are reading the brilliance of a statesman who knows what he is doing and has been delivering very effectively. He took office because people were upset about corruption. People in China didn't want corruption. He has led a massive, massive clampdown on corruption, cleaning up the Chinese Communist Party, creating a better environment for the private sector to do business where they feel like the government is honest, raising the standard of living. I mean, President Xi is an expert statesman, and we have completely gotten away from the concept of statecraft in the Western world. We've gotten to a kind of a vulgar democracy where, you know, it's a dog and pony show to get people elected, and at the end of the day, the big corporations rule, and the life of the population, the standard of living goes down. Statecraft is alive and well in China, and that's what you get from President Xi's writings. Oh boy, so what else is on people's minds? So Steve, Governance of China, Will Reed says kinky. Very, very good. What else is going on? Now, somebody else says, what's going on here? All right. My book should come in tomorrow, says Daniel Uko. Good. And, you know, I encourage you, if you really like the book, make a review of it on Amazon. Let them know, let other people know what you think of it, because, you know, we got to spread the word. There's already some very good reviews of it up on Amazon, and there you go. But what else is going on in the world today? Now, a lot is happening. I did a story the other day about this new program that the government has, where they're basically trying to do medical research about how to make, you know, like super soldiers, basically. It's a new program from, like, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, and it's like they've got a grant, and they're doing a new program. And so I started looking into the history of medical research by the U.S. government and experiments by the U.S. government. Oh my gosh. People should read Bill Blum. William Blum, Bill Blum, the writer, brilliant scholar. He has documented what the U.S. government has done in order to develop military technology over the course of the 20th century. Oh boy, folks, you should read about what the government has done. And I went over it in my story, but I'll kind of reiterate some of it here. Operation Sea Spray. Operation Sea Spray. What was that? That was a program where they were essentially spraying bacteria and chemical weapons on U.S. military personnel. And just you know, and not just U.S. military personnel, but on the city of San Francisco. They were dispensing bacteria all over the city of San Francisco in order to see what the effect would be. It was to mimic a chemical warfare attack. Somebody died. Whole bunches of people got sick. They were actually carrying out, you know, experiments, seeing what the result of a chemical attack would be on the city of San Francisco. At least one person died as a result of this. That's intense. I know this sounds tinfoil hatty. I know this sounds like some Alex Jones stuff. But read about Operation Sea Spray. Google it, or read about Project Shod, right, which stood for Shipboard Health and Defense. Read about that. How they were spraying dangerous chemicals like sarin nerve gas and sulfur dioxide onto U.S. military personnel. Or read about how the Department of Defense, this is the most despicable to me. So for about a decade, the U.S. Department of Defense was doing experiments with what they called full-body radiation, which is basically what would happen if, you know, you were in a nuclear war or you got nuclear fallout all over you. And so they were going to low-income African-American cancer patients and saying, hey, you know, we're going to do this experiment on you. It might cure you. It might cure you. There was very little chance of it curing them. But they were basically subjecting low-income African-American cancer patients to full-body radiation. The Department of Defense was doing that. Not telling them, by the way, what they were doing to them. They were putting, you know, nuclear waste all over them just to see what would happen, right? There's a whole history of the U.S. government using American soldiers, especially American GIs, but not just American GIs, also American civilians, the American population, as lab rats for their medical experiments. Very scary. Now, this new program that is being developed, they say that they're not going to use actual human bodies. They're going to use human body simulators. Human body simulators. I don't know what a human body simulator is. Sounds pretty weird. But they swear, oh no, no people, no human beings are going to be involved. But what's interesting about that is if you looked at when they were doing Operation Sea Spray or Project Shod or the Department of Defense full body radiation, that was classified. They weren't announcing to the public, oh, just so you know, we're spraying chemical weapons on people to see what happens. They weren't doing that. Of course they weren't going to announce it. It was classified. Now, the public papers say that only human body simulators will be involved in these new experiments that they're doing. Only human body simulators, they swear. But hey, don't believe me, right? I mean, I know this sounds a little tinfoil hatty, right? If I heard this, I would go, huh. I would go, huh. This sounds a little bit much, Caleb. I would go, huh. Google Operation Sea Spray. Get on there and Google it now and read about what they did. Google Project Shod for Shipboard Health and Defense. Read about it. Read about Department of Defense full-body radiation. Look up Bill Blum, a very respected scholar, his work. This is for real. There's a whole history of the U.S. military using American soldiers and American civilians as lab rats for experiments. It's scary. And they did it in other places, too. You can read about the infamous syphilis experiments that they carried out in Guatemala. Very, very awful stuff. You know, there's a whole history of some really nasty kind of things. The kind of things that we read about the Nazis doing in their concentration camps, using human beings as kind of tests in these demented experiments. You can read about the U.S. government having its share of things like that. It's very, very intense stuff that we're looking at here. But don't take my word for it. Look up the information, right? And again, we don't know, right? I mean, the public documents say that this new experiment that the U.S. military is doing, it will only contain, they say, it will only contain human body simulators. No actual people will be involved in the experiments. They swear. So, I mean, that's what the public documents say. But it's very crazy to look into that information. Crazy stuff. Oh, and Michael Ladson asks about MKUltra. Thank you, Michael. Very good point. MKUltra, and that was mainly the CIA. That was a CIA operation where they were experimenting with LSD and hallucinogens on people. You can read all about that. That's very, very, very crazy. They were going to college campuses, going to prisoners, going to brothels, and getting people high on LSD, getting people tripping and all of that, and seeing the results, you know. And again, sounds tinfoil hatty, right? It sounds a little Alex Jonesy. Look up MKUltra. It's not a figment of our imagination. This stuff is in the congressional record. I didn't make this up. Crazy. There's a whole history of the U.S. government doing a lot of shady things, not just to people around the world, because that's the way they always present it, right? It's always like, well, you know what? We have to bomb and kill these people in Korea because we're keeping you safe. We're here to protect you from those people over there, those bad people over there, right? The drones program, right? The drones. Well, we have to have drones and kill civilians because we're keeping you safe. Is it you or them? I mean, we could kill them, but it keeps you safe. Well, look at it. Look at what these programs have done. Many times we have been the ones. If you look increasingly at the militarization of the police, or read about, you know, that Operation Jade Helm. Do people remember Operation Jade Helm? Where they were basically practicing counterinsurgency warfare in a whole bunch of different Western states. The U.S. military was basically having a counterinsurgency practice. You know, I got to tell you, you know, people say the U.S. government is protecting us, and all these evil things like the drones and the chemical warfare and all of that is just to protect us from those people over there, those bad people in other countries. It's either us or you. Do you want it to be you or them? The U.S. government is not exactly our best friend, folks. They have a whole history of doing shady and nasty things to us also. I would say that the military and the Pentagon, and the CIA, they're serving the big corporations. They're not serving average Americans trying to make their lives better. We live in some interesting times. There is a gap, but there you go. I mean, again, now others say he is a government-run AI system. Wow, I've never heard of that. That sounds a little bit interesting to me. Jack Ruby's psychologist did MK experiments. I didn't know about Jack Ruby having a psychologist. I just knew that Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. That's interesting as well. But there you go. I mean, there's a whole history. I mean, read about MKUltra, you know, read about Operation Sea Spray, read about Operation Shad. There's a whole history of this. And, you know, during the late 70s, the Church Committee, very famous, the Church Committee, they did revelations about the work of the FBI and CIA. And all this was like public record. They documented it. During the 1970s, the Socialist Workers' Party sued the FBI. They took the FBI to court. And they took the FBI to court and revealed all kinds of stuff the FBI had done to keep them from winning elections, to keep them from recruiting people, infiltrating them. All this was public record. You know, all this stuff. COINTELPRO, the COINTELPRO program, which was basically to suppress black protests, to suppress the peace movement, Operation Shad, Operation Sea Spray, MKUltra. I mean, all this stuff was public record at one point. But now, if you tell people about it, if you walk around, if you say, hey, to somebody on the street, hey, did you know the government had a program where they were giving people LSD? They look at you like, really? Oh, okay, you know, and I bet the moon landing didn't happen, right? And the space aliens did 9/11. Oh, God, you know, okay, yeah, you're very good there, Caleb. Yes, the government had a program giving people LSD. Okay, you know, why don't you go, you know, go check into Bellevue Hospital now? No, folks. There's a whole history of this stuff, and people realize it. So there you go. And, you know, as much as I don't agree with Alex Jones, I think a lot of the stuff he says is questionable. The fact that they shut him down on YouTube, you know, the fact that they shut him down on all these different outlets on a single day, that's something to be concerned about. But anyway, let's get back to why you all came here to watch this anyway. Now, Jimmy Dore repeatedly called China fascist. Well, I'm sorry, I don't agree with Jimmy Dore about that. I think China is a socialist country. They have a state-run economy. They're raising the standard of living of the population. Fascism is about destruction. It's about tearing things down. It's about persecution and murder in order to preserve the rule of profits. Basically, when there's a crisis of capitalism, there's one section of society that emerges that wants to solve it by moving forward, by planning out the economy, by building, by constructing, and there's another sector that emerges that is based on punishment and death and destruction. And that's what fascism is. If you look at the Ku Klux Klan that emerged after the Second World War, you look at the Black Hundreds Party in Russia, you look at the National Socialists of Germany, the Fascisti of Italy, the Phalangists or the Falangistas in Spain. If you look at, you know, fascist movements are about death and destruction. Pinochet, when he came to power in Chile, did he, you know, it wasn't like, oh, our society's in a crisis, so I'm going to build things and help people and build things up. No, Pinochet came in, he had kind of a populist appeal, but he killed people in mass, he slashed government programs, he engaged in mass destruction. Fascism is mass destruction and political repression, sadism, cruelty, lynch mobs, torture, in order to preserve the rule of profits. And that's why fascism almost always leads to war. Because, you know, the destruction, once it kind of runs its course and doesn't make things better within the country, then they expand globally. And if you look at when Hitler came in, right, the first couple years after Hitler came to power, it was just lynch mobs and terror on the streets, the SA or the stormtroopers going around murdering people, and it got to the point that things were so chaotic within Germany. You had the infamous Night of the Long Knives, where the leaders of the Nazi Party actually killed off the people who brought them to power, the stormtroopers, the street fighters who brought them to power. So, you know, I mean, that's what fascism is. Fascism is mass terror and destruction in order to preserve the rule of capitalism. And it's a form of right-wing Bonapartism. It's kind of a mass movement created by the capitalists to preserve their system in a time of crisis. And it's based on destruction. And to be fair, sometimes the fascists have kind of a left-wing appeal, right? But it's destruction. It's always about destruction, right? It's always about tearing things down, destroying, tearing down ordinary people, tearing down the masses, destruction. That's what fascism is all about. It's destruction, sadism, delight in cruelty, hurting people, political repression, torture, mass destruction, war, killing, in order to preserve the rule of profits. And that is not what China is doing. China is just not doing that right now. In fact, if you look at China right now, it's the opposite. They are building like you wouldn't believe. 700 million people lifted out of poverty. You should read about the programs that they have in the Far East, in Russia right now with the revival of agriculture. You should read about, you know, the efforts to eliminate poverty that are going on in Tibet, for example, and how these Tibetan families that have been up in the mountains never had running water or electricity or being moved into modern housing. I mean, this is really exciting. And the other thing I wanted to say, I want to bring this up too, because there's a lot of talk now. They're playing up, it's really crazy. I gotta love this. So, this is the Wall Street Journal, a conservative paper actually owned by Rupert Murdoch. And you all remember the ban the mosque protests that were going on, right? You go back to like 2010. There was talk there was going to be a mosque in New York City. I think it was 2009. There was going to be a mosque in New York City in Lower Manhattan. They said it was going to be near the World Trade Center area. Oh, they wanted to ban the mosque. It was this big movement to ban a mosque in New York City. Well, it was like mosques can never be constructed. Oh, if there's a mosque in Lower Manhattan, this is disrespect. People saying that mosques are dangerous places. All this stuff about like, if Muslims are allowed to set up their worship site, we're all going to die and they're all going to kill us. Well, I wanted to show you the Wall Street Journal today. Now, all of a sudden, the Wall Street Journal that was urging mosques to be banned, that says mosques should never be built, that Muslims wherever they go are dangerous, all of a sudden they're playing up the rights of Muslims in China. Right? They're talking about Uyghur oppression, right? And there's a lot of disinformation coming out about that. A lot of this can be traced back to Saudi media and no one else. And Saudi media is not exactly reputable for its credibility. A lot of false reports are coming out. But what's interesting is what is not mentioned in the articles in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere talking about Uyghur oppression is that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government is going out of its way to support Muslims right now. They are building monasteries. They are giving grants to people in order to go to school and become imams. They are building Muslim study centers. They are doing all kinds of things to support Muslims right now. Big efforts are going on to support Islam in China, right? You didn't read that, but the Chinese Communist Party made errors, right? During the Cultural Revolution most especially, but before that and somewhat a little bit after that, there was an anti-Islamic, feeling that there was some feeling that Islam, because it's a religion and it's not, rooted in dialectical materialism and socialism, that it was something that should be, suppressed. But now they have the opposite approach. And the same goes for Tibetan Buddhism. In China, they are constructing, the Chinese government is paying for, constructing, building Tibetan Buddhist seminaries and study centers and monasteries, right? The government of China is going out of its way to fund and promote Islam that is not extremist Islam, right? That's the thing. Now, the Saudis, and you've got Afghanistan, you got that Afghan border, and there's extremists coming over, and there's people being recruited from China and the Muslim regions to go and fight alongside the extremists in Syria, and there are some big problems there. So the response of the Chinese government is to fund, to subsidize, to promote Islam that is anti-terrorist, that supports building a healthier society in China. So the Chinese government is going out of its way to promote Islam that is not terrorist, while at the same time they suppress terrorism and Saudi influence and those forces that want to destabilize the Muslim regions. So that is being left out of all these reports. The fact that the Chinese government is going out of its way to subsidize that. And you'll never see that, in the USA. You're not seeing that. So there you go. So that's their response. I wrote an article about this stuff back in 2013 when this got going, about jobs not drones, and how basically the response of the Chinese Communist Party in both Tibet and the historically Muslim region is to build up, is to bring economic investment in there, give people jobs, give people good livelihoods so they don't turn to terrorism. That was the response, and it's had a good result. I mean, terrorist attacks are down. But it's interesting. I fear. The U.S. media is trying to play up this idea that somehow Muslims are being persecuted in China. This is not a good sign. I think there are some forces in the power structure here that would like to make the Muslim regions of China into the new Syria and try to have some kind of insurgency, and that would not be a good thing at all. It wouldn't be good for the people there. I mean, look at the people of Syria. Are they any better off since the USA and all these different countries have been arming and promoting the overthrow of the Syrian government, right? Things don't get better, right? If you want to criticize these governments, you can do that, but do they ever make things better by promoting civil wars? I mean, Libya, look at Libya. Look at Iraq. Look at Afghanistan for the last 16 years. These countries do not get better as a result of U.S. military interventions. It's blatantly obvious. Now, Faith Virtue says that we need to watch John Pilger's The Coming War on China. That's a very, very good movie. I really liked it. And John Pilger's a great guy. I have met him. I've talked with him. I've emailed back and forth with him. Brilliant, brilliant man. Brilliant filmmaker. Making great movies going back to like the 70s and 80s. Just an amazing Australian filmmaker, John Pilger. It's a real privilege to have been able to interact with him. I know that he reads my email newsletters, and you know, we've corresponded before. Great guy. I totally agree with that people should watch that. But anyhow, but what's going on here? What is new? Now, I wanted to talk to folks. You know, I mentioned in one of my videos earlier. Do folks know about the Hyperloop trains? The Hyperloop trains. Now, this is the idea, and it was actually, I guess, I read that Elon Musk had been the first to propose it, but actually he wasn't. Apparently, folks in Switzerland were talking about it first. But then Elon Musk was talking about it. But now China is actually in the process of doing it. They have launched a Hyperloop train program. And basically what this would mean is that you know, instead of having exposed tracks, they would build trains that were in a tunnel. And this tunnel, they would create a vacuum. And this vacuum would enable the trains to go at very, very high speeds. China is predicting that by the year 2021, they will be able to have trains that will be able to go over 930 miles an hour. 930 miles an hour, right? You know, the article I read was saying basically that means a train could go from San Francisco to New York City in 3 hours. 3 hours. That's an 8-hour flight, right? But a train ride, 3 hours, right? That's what they're predicting with this Hyperloop train technology, right? Where you have a tunnel and you create like a vacuum so that you don't have any like air resistance and the trains can reach really, really high speed. I think that's really, really exciting. Elon Musk proposed it. Swedish scientists talked about it, but China is actually doing it. China is the way of the future because advancing technology is in China's interest, right? If we're able to advance alternative energy, that's good for China, right? One of their weaknesses is the fact that they have to import oil and natural gas. It's a weakness for them. That's why they're desperate to control the South China Sea, to make sure their oil tankers are never blocked, and that this Asian pivot is actually a big problem for them because at any point the USA could veto their economy, could set up an oil veto. You know, with a military blockade, I mean, the lights don't come on mainland China. And China is in the process. It's very interesting. Their consumption of oil and gas has been increasing in the last years very, very rapidly, but they're in the process now with their new energy vehicle laws mandating that the new cars that are created in China be new energy vehicles that don't run on gasoline. They're in the process of kind of weaning themselves off fossil fuels in order to get stronger. And again, that doesn't weaken them. Getting off of fossil fuels is good for China, but it's not good for the oil bankers, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, the Rothschilds, these rich families that run the Western world, these billionaire monopolists. They want to keep the world on an oil-based economy so that they can be in control because they have the oil markets cornered, right? The Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud, all of that. You know, the Western world basically controls the oil markets. Now, Russia has broken out of them, Venezuela, Iran. There are some exceptions where on the oil markets you have independent countries. However, it's pretty clear that, that Wall Street wants to keep the world addicted to oil, wants to crush alternative energy of any kind, whether it's solar or fusion or whatnot, even trains they don't like. They want to crush all of that in order to keep the world under their grip. Like I've always told people, you know, it's about keeping the world poor so that Wall Street can stay rich. It's about holding back economic development, and that's what it's all about, and that's economics. That's the understanding here, is that there are certain forces with entrenched power on the global economy, billionaire financial elites tied into the London Stock Exchange, tied into the World Bank and the IMF, you know, these huge corporations. You know, Chase Bank is very much tied in with ExxonMobil. You know, you can go down the line. And these huge, you know, HSBC Bank, which is very much tied in with BP and British Petroleum, these, you know, gigantic oil banking elites that run the world, they are at the point where the only way they can really hold on to their power and their monopoly, I should say their monopoly, not their wealth, right? They're going to keep their wealth. No one's going to take their wealth from them. But their monopoly and their control over the world economy, the only way they can keep it going is by keeping the world poor. And so they're doing that. They're keeping the world poor to maintain their monopoly. And China and Russia and Venezuela and Iran and all kinds of countries, Nicaragua, all kinds of countries around the world, have broken out of their grip and are developing and are making themselves wealthier by controlling their own economy. And that's what Wall Street cannot stand. And it's not the Cold War. It's not Marxism, Leninism versus the Western world. It's independent countries that control their economies versus the global capitalist market that is destroying the world. That's the new situation. Now, the financial elite want complete privatization and unregulated financial market for the entire planet. That's said by Faith Virtue. Yes and no, right? And I think this is an interesting thing, and this is a divide. You know, there is in the USA, there has been for a long time, like a lower level of the wealthy, right? Like people like, you know, like the Koch brothers, right? The Koch brothers were never part of that oil banking elite. Their father was forced to flee the United States and move to the Soviet Union so he could, you know, put his oil developments into practice. Fred Koch. And you've got like, you know, like Sheldon Adelson, right? He's a wealthy real estate capitalist in Las Vegas, but he's lower level. And you've got, you know, different members of people that are capitalist billionaires, but they're not part of the club. And they want complete deregulation. And they have resentment against like the Morgans and the Rockefellers and others because basically the entrenched, the richest of the rich, the entrenched old money order in the United States, they're at the point where they say, you know what, tax me more, right? If we can, they've got it set up so they won't have to pay taxes anyway. And, you know, if the tax rate goes up on all the other rich people, good for them, you know, and then they can afford it too. They can afford to pay a little bit more. And they've, you know, they're tied in with Harvard and Yale, and they have a more of a social democratic worldview. The libertarian stuff, the idea that capitalism is paradise, that's from the lower levels of the ruling class in the United States. The folks that they are obviously raving anti-communists. They want to deregulate everything, and they live under the illusion that everyone could be rich if they just work hard. Look, I'm rich. You know, why can't everybody be rich? But they have this resentment against the elites who have basically rigged the government to work in their favor. And this kind of middle strata, this group of people that maybe they own huge hotel chains or something like that, you know, the Walton family, others like that. And I guess the Walton family is now anti-Trump. They've turned against Trump. Walmart has joined the anti-Trump crusade. It took them a while, but you got these lower levels of American capital, wealthy American capitalists that are not part of the club, and they're dying. They're dying. They're going out of existence. Right? Capital is concentrating, and they're dying. And you also had like an upper middle class, people that were like wealthy, you know, doctors, lawyers, people like that who, you know, I mean, they were quite wealthy. They were making, you know, six figures. They lived in, you know, wealthy suburbs. You know, I think about Ohio, like Hudson, Ohio, for example. You know, that was a wealthy suburb. The people there were not part of the ruling class, but they were super, super wealthy. You know, and you think about that section of U.S. society. That section of U.S. society, that upper middle class of people that are, you know, not capitalists, but they're really, really well off. And you think about the lower levels of American capital, of the American ruling class, people that are billionaires and elites and have lots and lots of power, but they're not part of that club with the Rockefellers and the Morgans and the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and all of that. You think about that strata that has always been a big part of U.S. society and has been the more Republican section, right? Because they are more conservative. They want the government out of things. They're thinking more about their short-term gain, less about, you know, the interests of global capital. They're not tied in with you know, the big think tanks. Maybe a lot of them sell military hardware and are involved in the military-industrial complex. But that section is dying. And Donald Trump, in a lot of ways, Donald Trump's presidency represents that section of U.S. society. It's kind of like they want to go down fighting. It's their last stand. It's the Alamo. It's the Alamo for those sections, right? Because global capitalism no longer needs them. Wealth is concentrating in the hands of the billionaire, internationally tied financial elite, and that this lower level section of American capitalism, you know, when they say "Make America Great Again," they say "Make an America where we can be billionaires again." This isn't fair. You know, they want to go back to the Cold War days, the booming economy where you could have a huge middle class of people that were wealthy, but they weren't part of the club. And that's what Make America Great Again really means. And that's a lot of the folks that are tied up with Team Trump. They're special little interest groups. You got the Miami Cubans, a lot of wealthy Miami Cubans who fled. You got Sheldon Adelson. Who else? You've got other sections. And when I say Sheldon Adelson, I'm not saying Israel lobby, right? Because a lot of the folks in Israel are not tied in with the Likud party and Sheldon Adelson. That's just one section of the pro-Israel section of U.S. society. I'd say most of the folks that are pro-Israel are not pro-Trump, which is interesting to look at. People make it sound like there's one, you know, shady Israel lobby that has, you know, that's not how it works. A lot of that Israel lobby stuff is a little bit screwed up. But, you know, there's certain interest groups, you know, wealthy people in the USA that are not part of the club. For example, the exiles from Iran. It's pretty clear the Trump administration is pandering to the allies, the wealthy people grouped around the old royal family, the Shahs of Sunset. The wealthy people, Southern California, were tied in with the Shah, billionaires, millionaires in Iran who fled to the United States after the 1979 revolution. Trump is pandering to them like crazy. The speeches he gives, where he's like, oh, the great Persian nation is wasting its money. This is straight up Pahlavi ideology, right? The Pahlavi family that ruled, that ruled Iran before the revolution, they were very racist. They had very racial supremacist ideas. They admired, the Shahs admired and openly admired Adolf Hitler, and they told Iranians that they were a superior race, that Persians were like the ruling race. That kind of thing. That kind of thing is very popular among, the wealthy, millionaire, billionaire outfits that fled Iran after the 1979 revolution. Most of them are in Southern California. And the Trump administration is really pandering to them, along with pandering to the Netanyahu, Likud wing of Israeli politics, along with pandering to the Miami Cubans, along with pandering now to the China lobby, just these vendetta anti-China people, Peter Navarro, Tim Lighthizer. That the Trump administration has specific constituencies that they've kind of aligned themselves with, and that they're kind of pandering to, whereas most of the population is rather critical of the Trump administration. But Trump, it's a good marketing strategy. If you find a bunch of little niches, you can rule. A bunch of little niches, you can rule, and that's kind of what the Trump administration has done. And it's a kind of a diverse coalition, but it's pretty clear that it's made up of sections of American capital that are dying. The U.S. economy can no longer tolerate having huge amounts of millionaires and billionaires. We're transitioning toward huge amounts of concentration of wealth in the country, and that huge lower levels of the ruling class, upper middle class elements. It's fading away, and it's the last hurrah. This is the Alamo. This is Davy Crockett at the Alamo. This is showdown at the OK Corral. This is the lower levels of American capital, basically saying, we're going to go down fighting. We're not going to surrender. That's kind of what's happening with the Trump administration, in my view. But there you go. How often do you go to State Department briefings? Well, I'm based here in New York, so I'm not going to State Department briefings very much these days. But when I do, when I'm in D.C., I'll go to them. And some of the interactions I had at the State Department briefings, you should watch them. Folks should watch them. When I pressed John Kirby about Israel and nuclear weapons and the emails that came out, people should watch the argument I had with Heather Nauert about how she was basically creating the opening for Syrian terrorists to carry out a chemical attack. That was quite an interesting exchange I had. But I don't go very much because I'm based here in New York. But I go to D.C. a lot. I was there last week for that, that protest, where the 24 neo-Nazis showed up and, thousands of people were opposing them and all of that. But there you go. There you go. All right. So, folks, I've got here Getting Rich Without Capitalism. People have asked me, hey, Caleb, why don't you do an audiobook? Well, I'm not going to do a full audiobook, but just for the fun of it, just for something to do here on a Saturday afternoon in my Brooklyn apartment, I am going to read to you from the introduction of my book. So bear with me. I'm only going to read for a little while, but maybe you'll like it. This is the introduction to Getting Rich Without Capitalism by Caleb Maupin. A dramatic reading. Not dramatic. I'm just going to read you. Almost all people have some desire to be rich. That's why so many people play the lottery. That's why reality TV shows portraying the lives of wealthy people are so popular. There's nothing wrong with aspiring to become wealthy. I'm just going to hold the book here in shot so people know what I'm reading. There's nothing wrong with aspiring to become wealthy. To be wealthy means a huge level of safety. Rich people don't have to worry about losing their jobs, their homes, or whether they can pay their bills. Rich people have time to pursue their own dreams and aspirations without being chained to a desk or an assembly line, toiling away for some boss. In the world that we live in, wealth means power, and those who want to do good in the world and try to change things for the better often wish they had a huge pile of cash to pour into their noble efforts. There is nothing wrong with wanting a better life. Nobody wants to be poor. Poverty is a state of being defined by deprivation. Poor people are without quality living conditions. To be poor often means lacking basic services like healthcare and education. Around the world, to be poor often means to be malnourished, and even for those who are not malnourished, their access to food is below basic standards. The U.S. Department of Agriculture keeps track of food insecurity and says that at this point, even in the USA, supposedly the richest country in the world, 41.2 million people, including 6.5 million children, are food insecure. Many young Americans go into debt paying for their education, hoping that with a degree they can get a better job and be more financially stable. Many working-class Americans are diligently saving their money in order to invest it in the stock market, hoping that they have a shot of getting ahead and living a life of luxury and security. Things aren't going too well in America these days. If you walk through the neighborhoods in Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Chicago, or other industrial centers in the heartland, you will see many empty, foreclosed homes. The next generation of Americans are dealing with the fact that they will not have the good standard of living that their parents once had. The good-paying industrial jobs are gone, and even the retail jobs are starting to dry up as big box stores close down. The income of average Americans is dropping, and Walmart is being replaced by Dollar General. The decline of the American standard of living isn't just causing us to tighten our belts. Along with it are a whole new layer of societal problems. Young people are stuck in low-wage jobs, living with their parents and turning to drugs. Opioid deaths are rising to epidemic levels. The humiliation and shame, the stress and the fear, the insecurity experienced by so many Americans is certainly playing a role in the number of mass shootings and suicides. To not be able to support oneself, to be deprived of the ability to have your own home or your own life, to start your own family, is destroying the mental health of millions. But who is keeping you from becoming rich? Under such circumstances, it is no wonder that shows like The Real Housewives of New Jersey and Rags to Riches are popular. Plans for getting rich, or more accurately, finding a way out of poverty and decay, isn't just an afternoon fantasy or a daydream. It is the burning urgency. No one wants to have their life turned into another statistic. No one wants to feel that they have failed in life. While things are going badly for millions of Americans, some people are getting rich. Perhaps the best way to describe it is getting richer, because these folks were pretty rich to begin with. I'm talking about the payday lenders, who take advantage of people living paycheck to paycheck and figured out ways to suck even more money out of those who are already struggling to get by. I'm talking about the pharmaceutical companies that have consciously pushed doctors to overprescribe opioids and get people hooked. I'm talking about the fat cats who own the steel companies and auto giants and close down their factories in the United States, shipping jobs to countries where they can get away with paying lower wages. I'm talking about the prison contractors who see crime and mass incarceration as a way to make bigger profits. I'm talking about the corporations and companies that lay off their hardworking employees who get paid minimum wage and replace them with convicted criminals who work for pennies an hour inside the prison system. I'm talking about the big corporations who get paid to make bombs, drones, tanks, and weapons of mass destruction. The CEOs who are sending sons and daughters of the American heartland to the Middle East as seeing war as a great business opportunity. The problem with these people isn't that they are getting rich. The problem with these people is that they are already rich, and now they are getting richer by making this country and the world poorer. There is no reason for the American people to be getting poor. Oil and natural gas are the most valuable resources in the world, and we have plenty of them right here in America. America is actually the top natural gas producer in the world and third in oil. Despite a huge boom in natural resources and energy production, we as a country are continuing to get poorer. The people getting rich from our oil and natural gas and the coal beneath our feet have names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, Rothschild, and DuPont. The same clique of international bankers that are getting us into wars and signing us up for crooked job-killing trade deals are getting rich from our natural resources. On election day, these billionaires put up Republicans or Democrats. They'll talk about how they love God and country, but how patriotic can they be when they are grinding the working families of this country into greater poverty while they set up one global financial dictatorship? The only God these people worship is money. Cutting their taxes and liberalizing the market isn't going to help you or me at all. The policies pushed by the two major parties are making these bloodsuckers even more rich while making the rest of us even poorer. But imagine if things were different. Imagine that the profits from America's booming oil and natural gas resources were going into the public treasury. Imagine that this money could be used to build high-speed railways, connecting the heartland of America to the coasts. Imagine this money could be used to refurbish our university system. So once again, we were churning out the smartest engineers and scientists in the world and making huge scientific breakthroughs in fields like fusion energy and artificial intelligence. We could assemble the smartest technicians, architects, and visionaries to create a 5-year plan to completely remake the United States from top to bottom. With the money now being wasted on foreign wars and bailouts and tax credits, we could dispatch a brain trust to directly organize the population to build a whole new America. Imagine every unemployed American between the age of 18 and 30 being hired into an army of American rebirth. This army could be dispersed across the country in bright green uniforms to rebuild our crumbling water systems, refurnish our schools, build new storm levees, construct new efficient power plants, all while getting paid a decent wage to do it. Beyond this, imagine that our steel mills and auto factories were hiring once again, and it was guaranteed that they wouldn't be moved overseas because these vital industries were owned by the American people and not operated to make a profit. The wages of auto workers and steel workers would be carefully regulated by law, as would the price of steel in American-made cars. Imagine the banks giving subsidies and loans to young Americans to start their own companies, launch high-tech startups, design their own innovative business models. Instead of banks ripping off working families with predatory loans or wrecking small businesses with crippling debt, money lending would be in the hands of the state. Under a monopoly on financial credit, the government credit would be granted not so bankers could make money, but based on what the local community and the country needed overall. Interest from state loans would go into the public treasury, paying for more public services, scientific research, technology, and construction. In this new America, healthcare facilities, from the drug manufacturers to the hospitals to the local pediatrician's offices, would be under public control. Healthcare would be guaranteed to everyone as a basic human right, and drug prices would be set by central planners in order to ensure that they were affordable. The life and health of the American people would no longer be left in the hands of those who seek to make a profit, but would be in the hands of the entire community. Educating the youth would become a national priority, not a place for student loan sharks and charter school grant hustlers to make money. Children would stop being cogs in a decaying educational machine and instead become a national priority, with everyday Americans understanding that it was their patriotic duty to make sure that the kids of tomorrow have a better life than we have today. And yes, in the context of this new America, in which society was being organized according to a rational plan, you and other people in your community could get rich quite easily. Your opportunities would soar. The chances of you and your family moving ahead in the world would be astronomical. The standard of living would increase, and the kind of innovation and creativity displayed by Americans in the past would resurface stronger than ever before. This vision of the United States, in which the population is unleashed to become prosperous, and the hope for working hard to become wealthy, is no longer restricted to the hands of a privileged few, has a name. It is called socialism. Now, that's not what you thought socialism was. You thought socialism was raising your taxes. You thought socialism was some guy in a fur hat coming to seize your house and your car. You wouldn't be alone in thinking that. Socialism has certainly been smeared and slandered. But the kind of drastic transformation of a country that I've just described as the potential socialist vision for the United States is exactly what socialism did in Russia, China, Cuba, Korea, Venezuela, Vietnam, and so many other parts of the world. Before 1917, Russia was an agrarian country led by a feudal czar. By 1936, it was producing more steel than any other country in the world. When Stalin put the peoples of the Soviet Union into motion with his 5-year plans, the world's largest hydroelectric power plant, the Dnieper Dam, was built. In just a few years, the Soviet Union became a booming center of the global economy, churning out more steel, more tractors, and constructing modern housing at a faster rate than any other country in the world. At the same time the rest of the planet was having a Great Depression, Roosevelt sent members of his administration to Moscow to directly observe the process. The Soviet Union's great construction projects were part of the inspiration for the Works Progress Administration and the Hoover Dam, Key West Highway, LaGuardia Airport, and so many other beautiful landmarks in the USA. China had no steel mills in 1949. Today it produces half the steel in the world in a state-controlled, centrally planned economy, managed by the China Steel and Iron Association. China now has the largest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. China has lifted 700 million people out of poverty and is building high-speed railways, stadiums, hydroelectrical power plants, water treatment facilities, and a huge amount of other necessities of life. In Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, the Chinese state-controlled machinery of production is humming along, laying foundations, hoisting rails, and lighting up the night sky with electricity. And do you think that this is making Chinese people poor? Are they being taxed into oblivion to pay for it all? On the contrary. Every day another Chinese person becomes a millionaire, and every week another Chinese billionaire is created. Even CNN admits that Chinese people are getting wealthier every day. Well, that's what I'm reading to you. That's from my new book, Getting Rich Without Capitalism. And that is what I'm talking about. A lot of people in the USA are convinced to oppose socialism because they are convinced, look, I've worked all my life, I've worked so hard to make lots and lots of wealth, I've got a house, I've got a car, I've finally got something, I've gotten ahead in this world, and the socialists and communists want to just tax it all away from me. That's a myth. You have been robbed. The American people right now are being robbed. And socialism is about putting an end to the robbery. It's about the American people rising up, taking control of their economy, and unleashing productivity and wealth like you've never seen before. So I just wanted to read you there from my book. But there you go. But anyway, enough of that. If you want to read the rest of it, you should all buy the book. What else is going on? Chris Hedges. I met Chris Hedges. Brilliant guy, good guy. He films his show in New York. Brilliant writer. He interviews a lot of people. I think he just interviewed Glenn Ford from Black Agenda Report. You know, good guy. What else are people asking about? Growth must be positive. That's what Koch universities tell us. I think that is insane, says Kinky. Well, right, we need to get out of fossil fuels. We need new sources of energy. But Wall Street and London are never going to let that happen, right? And in a weird way, they're not opposed to environmental laws either, because they get to write them, right? So they can put Russia and China out of business, and they can rig the environmental laws to make sure that we stay on oil, but at the same time, we make sure that developing countries aren't able to develop. I mean, it's just a big joke. It's all a big joke. Wall Street and London are being challenged now with the rising alternative from Russia and China, the Belt and Road, the Eurasian Economic Union. I mean, exciting things are happening. We've been going for a little while here. It's almost 2 hours. I think I'm going to cut it at the second hour. But folks, what do you want me to talk about? You know, start throwing your ideas out there. I am happy to talk about whatever folks want to talk about. What's going on here? Caleb, can you explain to me why Mao let the Gang of Four gain so much power? I don't know what was going on in Mao's mind. I was not there. I know that the fall of Lin Biao had a lot to, that was a turning point. When Lin Biao, if you read his speech to the first Chinese Communist Party Congress that they had in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, I believe it was 1969, Lin Biao, I mean, Mao just kind of showed up and waved. There's a famous photo of Mao walking into the Chinese Party Congress and waving, and he waves. He's very old at that point, very old man. But Lin Biao, look that name up, right? That's not a name. If Lin Biao came into the Chinese Communist Party, and he gave a speech to address the Chinese Communist Party Congress in 1969. And if you read that speech basically says that Wall Street and American capitalism is the main enemy of the people of the world. It criticizes the Soviet Union, saying that they are, quote, betrayers of people's war because they advocate peaceful coexistence. But at no point does Lin Biao say that the USA should align with China, China and USA should align, the Soviets are the main enemy. Lin Biao gave his speech, and it's like a Fidel Castro speech. It's a Kim Il-sung speech. He's saying, we need to have world communist revolution. That's basically what Lin Biao's speech to the 1969 Party Congress says. Lin Biao was then added to the Chinese Communist Party's constitution as Mao's successor. So when Mao died, it was Lin Biao who was supposed to replace them. And that was the party line. It was China was putting out like a Fidel Castro, Kim Il-sung, line about world communist revolution. And then a little bit later, after that party congress, Lin Biao disappears from Chinese politics. And no one says anything about it for a couple of years. The Gang of Four come in. A couple of years later, then, they have the Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius campaign. They announced that Lin Biao had tried to overthrow Mao in a coup. We don't know if this is true. This is just according to Chinese media and the Gang of Four, and who knows what was really going on. There's photos of a plane crash. They say Lin Biao was trying to flee to the Soviet Union. And it's after that, after the Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius campaign, that the Gang of Four really solidifies their power in China and starts doing the things that really, really define them as despicable, right? That's when, the Cultural Revolution had been a mobilization of young people You know, in China, the Red Guards, they called them, all the young people are deported from the cities to the countryside, and things start to get ugly. And the Cultural Revolution, instead of being like kind of a mass uprising against the party, being pushed by Lin Biao with Mao's blessing, the Cultural Revolution turns into kind of a daily life, you know, kind of campaign from the top, where the Gang of Four are directing things, and it's kind of, it enters a much more ugly stage. In all honesty, I'm not sure what Lin Biao was doing. I'm not endorsing Lin Biao. I'm at the point where I would say, you know, the Cultural Revolution itself, the whole Cultural Revolution needs to be looked at with a critical eye. But the fall of Lin Biao, when Lin Biao was out of there, after he gave that speech, Long Live the Victory of People's War, when he was out of there, when the Chinese Communist Party line stopped being that the Soviet Union wasn't truly revolutionary, when the line started being that the Soviet Union was the main danger, and that they were social imperialists and social fascists, they put out this film, The New Czars of Russia. When that became the line, when Nixon flies over to China and is welcomed as a hero, when China gets to the point where they're in Angola, the Gang of Four are basically in Angola supporting Jonas Savimbi and the CIA against the MPLA in Angola, which China has officially apologized for. They've apologized for that disgusting ultra-leftist policy from the Gang of Four. When the Gang of Four embraced Pinochet, the dictator of Chile put in by Wall Street, you know, at the time, you know, the Gang of Four are putting out this line that basically that they are going to align with the U.S. Against the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union are fake communists and they're the biggest enemy. Meanwhile, China is at home, you know, waging this daily life purge that makes life almost unlivable, where people are terrified they're going to be persecuted and killed for disagreeing with the party or disagreeing with the latest campaign. You know, people are beaten up for playing the violin or you know, wearing makeup. They're executing dogs. That's real nice, right? It was thought if you owned a dog, that was an anti-communist thing because it was like mimicking slavery. Right? It sounds like some of the PETA people in the USA, but somehow the Red Guards had a line that if you owned a dog, that was mimicking slavery. So they would go to your home and hang your dog in front of you and make you wear a sign, I practice petit bourgeois owning a pet. That's disgusting. I mean, stuff like that, I mean, come on. But anyway, that's when the Cultural Revolution took on kind of a vulgar character. I think it had a vulgar character beforehand with the Red Guards doing around stuff. It was a very problematic period. No one tells me the Cultural Revolution was a good time. I know there's a book, Some of Us, that is, you know, some Western scholars that re-examine the Cultural Revolution. It's some women. It's worth reading. I mean, they defend Mao in some ways, but even they talk about how it was a period in which a lot of awful things went on. But regardless, the Gang of Four, the rise of the Gang of Four culminated with the fall of Lin Biao. And when Lin Biao was out of there, when the Gang of Four was in there, and when Soviet social imperialism and that politics started espousing, that was the Gang of Four's real strength. And at that point, Mao is so old. I mean, if you read, Mao barely said anything. He barely did any public appearances at that time. He was so old, and he died in 1976. But the Gang of Four were really running things. That was Mao's wife. That was, you know, 3 other people, including somebody from Shanghai who was like a steel worker. And the Gang of Four are really, I mean, they're some of the most hated people. Anyone who lived through that period hates them. And when they were arrested, there was just mass celebration all through China. When Deng took power and he arrested the Gang of Four, declared that the Cultural Revolution was over and that they were going to start building socialism with Chinese characteristics, that was, you know, for the overwhelming majority of the population, that was a good sign. And then their standard of living started rising astronomically. And Deng Xiaoping started raising people out of poverty, building modern construction. You know, the idea that the Gang of Four, what they did was good for China, is really, really absurd. And, you know, Kermit Ninja says the Sino-Russian split must not repeat. Well, I'll tell you, you know, what's interesting is that you know, the Sino-Soviet split, what really spurned it more than anything, I mean, the official reason given was that Khrushchev's statement that he believed in the 3 peacefuls: peaceful coexistence between socialism and capitalism, peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism, and peaceful competition between the 2 systems. And China said it did not agree with that. And I feel like more than anything, because already China favored peaceful transition already. I mean, the China-aligned Communist Party in Indonesia, for example, was pursuing peaceful transition at that time with Sukarno. So China was not opposed to peaceful transition, right? I think they were opposed to telling people in countries that were brutal dictatorships, like South Africa, for example, that they could not take up arms. But more than anything, you know, China, they had just had their revolution, right, in 1949, so a decade later, they had their revolution, and that They felt like Khrushchev and this clique of people in Moscow were trying to tell the world communist movement how to operate, and in essence had reached a deal with Kennedy and with Wall Street imperialism that they would stop world revolution in exchange for détente, in exchange for kind of cooling the Cold War. Khrushchev and others would make sure there were not any communist revolutions around the world. And China had just had their revolution. They were in a state of revolutionary fervor. And they said, look, you can't, in Indonesia, where you can have a peaceful revolution, you can have an election, and Sukarno can get in, fine, all right, we support peaceful transition where it's possible. But if you look at South Africa, where the black people have no rights, how can you tell the African National Congress, how can Khrushchev tell the African National Congress they're not allowed to pick up weapons and take up the gun? How can Khrushchev tell people in countries like the Philippines that they aren't allowed to fight for land reform? And when people have no choice but to take up arms because they're living in a brutal dictatorship, they're being slaughtered, how does Khrushchev think he has the right to make a deal with Kennedy that he'll tell them that they're not allowed to engage in armed struggle just so that the Soviet Union can have the Cold War cool down a little bit and they can have détente? And I think there was a huge amount of resentment, and that China, they had just had their revolution, and they just had the Korean War. Let's not remember, China lost millions of people in the Korean War, where they went to aid North Korea as the Korean War was going on. And I think there was a feeling in China that, look, these bureaucrats in Moscow, Khrushchev, thinks that he can hold back the world revolution. We're not going to stand for that. And so they criticized Khrushchev, and in response, the Soviet Union pulled all of its economic aid out of China, right? And buildings were left half-building, blueprints were burnt, all kinds of economic assistance, technicians were pulled out. It was a disaster. And then Chinese students in Moscow were furious, so they protested about it. And then the cops went and beat them up in China. So or in the Soviet Union, the Chinese students who protested against Khrushchev's move. So based on that, you had the Sino-Soviet split. It was very, very ugly. And it was a feeling that China felt like the world revolution should continue, and that what Khrushchev was doing was unprincipled. I don't think a new Sino-Soviet split is going to happen today, and this is why. Because at that point, the ties, China was receiving a lot of economic assistance from the Soviet Union, right? That was really what was going on. The Soviet Union was giving them lots of economic assistance. Now, the tie between between Russia and China is not rooted in politics, and it's not Russia just giving China stuff. The tie is win-win, right? It's not the Soviet Union giving solidarity aid, it's win-win. China needs lots of oil and gas. Russia is constantly having to deal with the fact that Wall Street is trying to push them off the market and not allow anyone to buy their oil and gas. China buys loads and loads of oil and gas from Russia. Russia needs people to sell its oil and gas to. So at the end of the day, China needs Russia, Russia needs China, and the two of them doing business together is win-win and mutually beneficial. If China were to have a falling out with Russia, where would they get all that huge amount of oil and gas from? And if Russia were to have a falling out with China, they would lose one of the biggest customers of their oil and gas. There are huge pipelines that are being built, oil pipelines, gas pipelines being built, connecting Russia and China to each other. The two countries need each other. The two Eurasian superpowers, the Eurasian alliance, you could call it, is based on win-win. It's not about politics. It's not about, Russia giving stuff to China to help them develop and then expecting China to do whatever it says in exchange. That's not what's going on. It's a win-win agreement. The countries certainly have different interests, and I'm sure they disagree with each other. And there's points where they just don't see eye to eye, especially economically. Whereas China is all about getting out of alternative energy. Russia is focused on oil and gas, so they're not going to agree on everything. But pulling them apart won't just be about having an ideological disagreement. At the end of the day, pulling Russia and China apart would require prying them apart economically. And a lot of very wealthy people in Russia would lose out, and a lot of very wealthy people in China were to lose out. The two of them are right next to each other, and it makes perfect sense for them to do business with each other. So I don't think a new Sino-Soviet split is going to happen, because if that were to happen, it would not be in their economic interest. It would just be silly, and it would not make any economic sense. It's not about politics. It's not about communism. It's not about one country giving another country a lot of stuff and expecting them to be obedient to them politically. That's not what's going on now. It's a very, very different situation. There you go. But now, Kinky is saying, still, thank you, Khrushchev, I'm still alive. Well, that's a good point, right? Would it have been impossible? Now, that's an argument in Khrushchev's favor, right? Khrushchev arranged for détente and there was no nuclear war, right? Right? And that was the argument the Soviets always made, and they had a strong argument for it. Like, let's be real. Kinky has a point, right? The Soviets said, look, nuclear war is a disaster, right? And we have to do everything to hold off nuclear war. I remember, it's very funny, the leader of the Communist Party of Canada was a communist named Tim Buck, and I always thought that was funny. Like, maybe when he was on his deathbed, everyone was wondering who's going to appoint his successor. Like, who will be Tim Buck 2? There's a joke. But anyway, I actually have Tim Buck's book about Lenin and Canada here somewhere. I've got Tim Buck, the leader of Canadian communism. Actually, right here, yeah, I'll pull it up. Tim Buck, the leader of Canadian communism. I have his two books here, Lenin and Canada, and what's this other one? The Story of the Communist Movement in Canada by Tim Buck. He was the leading communist of Canada. And I remember Tim Buck, there's a TV interview with him that I saw, where they asked him about the Sino-Soviet split. And they said, what happened? And he said, oh, well, it's very simple. He had this, like, very folkish way. He was a very folky kind of, charming Canadian guy. And Tim Buck says, well, it's very simple. The Soviet Union says that peace is the top priority in the world, and that we need to make sure to do everything we can to make sure that there's world peace. Now the Chinese, on the other hand, say that if we need to have a little war here or a little war there in order to stop the U.S. imperialists, why, we can do that. But I think this is a small disagreement and not much is ever going to come of it. That's Tim Buck. It's probably like the southern version. It's not a Canadian accent, whatever. That was Tim Buck. And he was wrong in saying that that nothing was ever going to come of it, because a lot came of it. But that was his take on it, and that was essentially the disagreement, right? The Soviet Union was saying that that in order for there to be world peace, we need to basically tell countries around the world where people are fighting for liberation, countries like South Africa, countries in Latin America, that under no circumstances, no matter how badly they're being killed, no matter how badly they're being oppressed, they don't have the right to engage in armed self-defense, right? It's not that China was urging people to just be ultra-left, crazy adventurous. That wasn't what was going on. And in fact, you can see that China actually did encourage people to pursue peaceful transition. China always opposed left adventurism. They were never advocating insanity and violence. They were just simply arguing that countries in the developing world had the right to engage in armed struggles for self-defense against imperialism. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, took the position that under no circumstances could people in South Africa or Latin America take up the gun because the danger of world war was too big. And that's interesting. And one of Mao's last statements, someone was asking me about Mao and the Gang of Four, one of Mao's last statements is called "Down with U.S. Imperialism and Its Running Dogs." And I actually, because of some weird situations, I actually memorized a big section of it. And this is like one of Mao's last statements, and I'll recite it for you. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat the aggression. The danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, but revolution is the main trend in the world today. And that was basically China's critique of the Soviet Union. I'm sorry if I'm being silly there and memorizing things. The world is a strange place. But, that was the essence of China's criticism of the Soviet Union. China was committed to this, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Yes, nuclear war is a danger, but, we need to focus on spreading revolution. But ultimately, that didn't work out too well for China. During the Cultural Revolution, the country just stayed poor. It lost allies, and ultimately, with the rise of Deng Xiaoping, the position was that no one should be exporting revolution around the world. That's a bad strategy, right? And that everyone's country is their own business, right? And that having a communist international, right? That was part of Marxism, and it was like the Comintern and all that. That's not correct, and that in a lot of ways every country has to pursue its own path, right? And that no country should be spreading communist revolution all over the world. No country should be doing that. Every country has the right to pursue its own path. However, the only way that we're going to get out of the mess that we're in the world today is by developing independently and people building up their economies and trade between countries and win-win cooperation. And in order to do that, people are going to have to take control of their economies. So yes, people have the right to, and people should be pursuing socialism in their own country, but it should be their own socialism. It shouldn't be trying to copy another country's socialism. It should be a socialism rooted in their own country, their own culture, their own history. And that's what we've learned from the Cold War. The Cold War, in a lot of ways, the process of the Cold War was socialism and Marxism really shedding its origins. It no longer, like I talked about earlier, it stopped being the ideology of people in bars who were talking about how the French Revolution didn't go far enough. Do you hear the people sing Les Miserables? Young, rich people who thought the French Revolution didn't go far enough and, had these aspirations coming out of the Spring of Nations in 1848. That's how Marxism started. But over the course of the Cold War, that's what Marxism stopped being. Marxism increasingly became a way for people to take control of their country, get out of the irrationality of capitalism, and start raising people out of poverty. And it came from the third world, not the first world, as Marx predicted, because it was third world countries that were being held in a state of chronic poverty by capitalism. And that we've learned a lot over the course of the Cold War. And what we've learned is that, there doesn't need to be a communist international. No one should be spreading revolution all over the world. We've learned over the course of the Cold War that you can't copy socialist models. We've learned over the course of the Cold War that you can't, there's no, this notion that, that Marxism, Leninism is like the holy book, and that, we should practice it like a religion, and there's the holy word of Marx, and he said it, so it must be true, and on the third day, Karl Marx told us that on this day, that's not what it is, that Marxism is not religion. And China has really rescued Marxism from the Cold War. And that's what I get from reading the writings of President Xi. He is a scientific socialist, right? That's Frederick Engels. He wrote Socialism Utopian and Scientific. And that during the Cold War, a lot of the way communists expressed themselves was very utopian and religious. They had the holy book, they had the holy answer, they were going to give the whole of their lives to the struggle and go out and die, and it would be true, and they would be martyrs for the cause, and that by making Marxism into a religion, and by basically, if you look at it, the Catholic Church, right? They got the Pope in Rome, and that a lot of the way world communists thought during the Cold War is they had the Pope in Moscow, or the Pope in Beijing, or the Pope in Albania, who was giving them the instructions, and they were the adherents, and it was the global church of salvation, and it was a very religious outlook. No, let religion be religion, right? I consider myself to be a Christian. I get religion from religion. And I get Marxism and science from Marxism, right? Religion is religion, Marxism is Marxism. And when Marxism tries to be a religion, that's a death sentence, that's a disaster. Because at the end of the day, Marxism is not a religion. It is a method for understanding the world rooted in materialism. It's an understanding of the global class forces, how they operate, how history is progressing. And that's all it is. It's a tool. It's not a religion. And that China has really rescued socialism and Marxism from the Cold War distortion, the kind of religious fanaticism that came out of the Cold War era. And that's what they've done, and they're applying Marxism scientifically and not in a religious sense. And that's kind of the brilliance of it. What else is going on? Each country has its unique historical circumstances, says Ronnie Miller. Shout out to Ronnie Miller, a very brilliant, dedicated young man who is really well studied in Marxism and has my same understanding that this is a tool. This is a tool for making a better world and making a better life. It's not a romantic ideology. It's not a religion. Marxism is a science. It's a method of understanding the world, talking about class struggle, talking about historical advances. That's what Marxism is. And that Marx himself, if you read his pamphlet that I've got here, I've held this up before, 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Read this, right? Read this pamphlet. Those who say, oh, all the capitalists are bad, every party is just the same and we need communist revolution. That's not what Marx says in this pamphlet. That is not what Marx says. Read this pamphlet. Marx is understanding how there were divisions within the French ruling class that were creating openings for the workers. He understands what the 1851 coup by Louis Bonaparte was really about, and what the rise of Bonapartism in France was all about, and how the ruling class increasingly gets divided, and how the working class maneuvers within those divides and all of that. That's science. Marxism is scientific thinking. And that the kind of fervor and religious sentiment that it took on, Lenin rescued Marxism very much from the feelings that came out of the 1848 Spring of Nations and the kind of liberal idealism that began with. Lenin basically developed Marxism as something that would work in Russia and work in countries of the East. And now China has rescued Marxism from the religious aspect of it, the kind of mystical and martyrdom complex and ultra-leftism that emerged during the Cold War. So China has made Marxism scientific. Lenin made Marxism something that people in the developing world could apply, and something that wasn't rooted in first world aspirations for liberalism. You know, every generation comes along and updates Marxism and applies it in different ways to different circumstances. Marxism is a science. It's not a religion. And that I look at some of the mistakes I've made. Yes, I admit, Caleb Maupin, the man you're listening to, has made mistakes. And so have you, and so has Marx, and so has Lenin, and all of them made mistakes, right? And we all make mistakes. And I admit some of the mistakes that I've made in the past are rooted in looking at Marxism like a religion. And looking at it as if there is one correct way, and it's based on what the book says. That's false, and some of the mistakes I've made are based on that. And I urge people to think scientifically. Always be willing to question what you know. Always be willing to question what people are telling you. That's what I urge for you, because we need to apply scientific thinking to our understanding of the world. Learn from Marx, learn from Lenin, study it all, but don't apply it in a religious manner. Be willing to adapt and change. Be willing to see how the world works. Constantly be looking for what works and what doesn't. That's what I urge you to do. But always keep your eye on the prize, right? Keep your feet on the ground, but always keep your eye on the prize. Always keep your eye on the goal of building a world that is better for everyone, raising up the standard of living, getting us out of the mess of profits and chaos and suffering and death, because capitalism is leading us toward disaster. And anyone with a scientific understanding can see that. We need a society that's not controlled by profits, but is rationally planned in order to serve public good. We need that now more than ever. What a day. What a day. Right, so now I just got a super chat from somebody who calls themselves Joker. And Joker says, if democracy was created by one group of plutocrats fighting other group of plutocrats, why do you expect democracy to function differently in modern times? Well, first of all, let's talk about democracy, right? Democracy just means the rule of the people. We've never seen that, ever. Every society has had some kind of ruling class. Those who control the economic centers of power have ruled over it, right? Now, we have a republican form of government in which we have voting, but has it ever really been a democracy in the sense that the people rule? No. And actually, the origins of the term democracy, the ancient Greeks meant democracy as a vulgar thing. The ancient Greeks talked about, monarchy being a good thing, but monarchy degenerating into tyranny, tyranny being a bad thing, tyranny degenerating into plutocracy, plutocracy degenerating into oligarchy, oligarchy degenerating into a republic, which is a good thing, and then a republic degenerating into democracy, which they saw as mob rule and chaos. And republic was a good form of electing leaders, and democracy was a vulgar form. It was mob rule. At the end of the day, democracy is really only going to be possible when society as a whole controls the major means of production, when you have a rationally planned economy, and when everyone can really be involved in the political process, and you don't have a small clique of people controlling the major centers of economic power. To have real democracy, you can't have capitalism. But even under socialism, you see aspects that are not really democratic. A lot of socialist societies do have a party elite that controls things, or a party bureaucracy that is very centralized. And, socialist countries, the understanding is as socialism develops, as the level of material abundance develops, socialism will become more democratic in that sense. And then ultimately even, the aspiration that Lenin writes about in his book, State and Revolution, that Marx wrote about, is ultimately even democracy will fade away. And people will be increasingly moving toward in a society with so much abundance and so much stuff being developed, where so many material goods are there, where so little human labor is required, a one-hour work week, that increasingly will move to a world where very little need for a state exists, right? And that very little need for coercion even exists, and that society, people can just do what they want, do what they feel like, and take what they need, and that technology will have advanced so much, and it'll be just kind of a high-tech utopia in which even democracy itself will fade away. But democracy as an aspiration is a bit of an illusion, because at the end of the day, as long as a small group of people control the economy, that small group of people is going to control the government. And that the Western countries are really dishonest. If you go to the developing world, they'll tell you we have issues with human rights. If you go to any country, developing country, they'll tell you we have issues with human rights. We'd like to be more democratic, and we're trying to lead the country toward a state of material abundance and development and stability to the point that we can be more democratic than we are. But if you look at any developing country, the level of human rights that we have in the USA and the level of, I guess, democracy, even though it's not really a democracy, but the level of democracy that we have in the West is based on a level of material abundance, and even this democracy is still the rule of those who control the means of production. I remember when I was in Iran, I met with Iranians, and they said, we have a guided democracy, and so do you. Our democracy is guided by our religious leaders. The supreme leader, the ayatollahs, they guide the democracy. People get to vote. There's different parties, but at the end of the day, the religious leaders who led our revolution determine, make sure that the democracy stays in a framework that is what they agree with, and they control the economy and the major means of production. Our democracy in the USA is guided, but it's not guided by leaders of our revolution. It's not guided by political scientists. It's guided by people with lots and lots of money who operate behind the scenes and control it all. And yes, we get to vote. There's different parties, but at the end of the day, the same corporations control it. Every democracy under a system where a small group of people controls the means of production, every democracy is going to be guided or controlled by those with the economic power. Now, socialist countries are moving in a direction to get past this kind of rule by elites and to move towards having a society that's all-inclusive and more democratic. And the Bolivarian countries, Cuba, other countries, they've done things to kind of improve democracy, especially in everyday life, where people get to vote on the conditions in their particular factory. Things like that exist. Cooperatives and kind of workplace democracy or community involvement, but at the end of the day, right, that democracy is something that can only be realized after socialism has been fully realized on like a global scale, and even democracy itself is something that should be overcome because we want to get to a world without coercion. The rule of the people, this democracy, this word that goes back to ancient Greece, is a bit of a misnomer because, the Republican form of government, I would say, is superior to feudalism and the monarchy. But even within a republic, you're going to have, different forces with different amounts of power. So that's my response to that question from Joker. But there you go. All right, Splashman says the difference between a communist and a figure like Jesus is that while Jesus gives food to the poor, the communist will ask, how is poverty created? Jesus never questioned the system. Well, Splashman, there's a famous quote that's very similar to that. An activist in Latin America said, when I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. Very famous. But at the end of the day, I feel like you can find a lot of communistic, or I guess you could say utopian sentiments in the teachings of Jesus Christ in the Bible. For example, if you read the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, when she's giving birth to Jesus, or before when she, is celebrating the birth, if you read the Bible, I don't want to get too much into theology here because, everyone has their own religious beliefs and religion is people's personal business. But if you read the Magnificat, very famously, when Mary is celebrating the fact that she's going to give birth to Jesus Christ in the Bible, she very famously says he is coming to cast, to feed the poor, but to cast the rich away empty. And he's coming to drive the mighty from their seats, right? And that if you read a lot of it, it seems like if you look at the teachings of the Bible, in a lot of ways, Christ was telling his followers that they were fighting for some kind of communist utopia, right? It was religious, and it was a religious movement based on idealism. But if you read the texts of the Christian teaching, a lot of times it seems like Jesus is telling his followers that you're revolutionaries. We're fighting for a new kingdom, heaven on earth, kind of. And that comes across in a lot of the texts. And that's very interesting to note. I would recommend people read Karl Kautsky. Karl Kautsky, who is the leader of German social democracy. He wrote a very good book called The Foundations of Christianity. It's actually kind of a history of the Roman Empire, and he talks about the role that the early Christian church played in the Roman Empire, and how really Christianity became a vehicle for the first proletarians. Right? In ancient Rome, you had different classes. You had those who owned land, you had those who owned slaves, but the proletarians were those who owned nothing but their children. Right, and sold their labor power. They weren't slaves, they weren't owned by anybody else, but they had nothing but themselves and their family and their children. They were those who have children. That's actually what the word was rooted in. It meant persons who have children. And that in ancient Rome, in Rome itself, Christianity became the religion of the proletarians that were fighting for their rights against the patricians and the plebeians that ran society. and that the proletarians who rallied around Julius Caesar. Another very good book to read would be the Assassination of Julius Caesar by Michael Parenti, A People's History of Ancient Rome. You read that stuff, and that it comes across that, in Rome you had the first proletarians, people who sold their labor power to a boss, and that they weren't slaves, but they weren't landowners either. They owned nothing but their labor power, and I guess back then in ancient Rome, children and wives were considered to be properties. They were men. And that the proletarians, they rallied behind Julius Caesar, and they eventually adopted Christianity as their vehicle of expressing themselves. It's kind of an underground movement to fight for their rights. And that comes across in Karl Kautsky's beautiful book, The Foundations of Christianity. I think religion is fascinating, by the way. And I say that I'm a Christian in a very, very liberal sense. I'm not a fundamentalist or anything like that. But I grew up in a Christian church. In a lot of ways, I feel like I wouldn't have become a leftist. Why be a leftist? If it weren't for the Christian teachings that I received as a child, I probably wouldn't have become a leftist. I would have thought, hey, the world is full of evil people and just be selfish. But, the values that come out of Christianity that Christ kind of fought for in the context of Palestine at the time of Roman occupation, and the values that he put forward are very universal and speak to people in kind of a universal way. So I would say I'm a very liberal Christian, but I do consider myself to be a Christian. But anyway, enough about religion. Jimmy Chow says all souls are equal. I don't know about that. I'm not here to comment on that. Saying that all human beings are equal under God is a revolutionary concept in a slave society, says Kamsamal. Very, very good. Very, very good point. Very, very good point. Now, Kinky says, thank you so much, Caleb. Can't express how much I appreciate you. I'm not alone. Peace, brother. Well, thank you, Kinky, and I appreciate you as well. I appreciate all of you who get on these lives, all of you that are part of this conversation. We're doing something very, very special here. We talk about socialism and Marxism in a way that you're not going to hear on the university campuses these days from some identity politics obsessed professor who calls himself a Marxist. You're certainly not going to hear it from the hateful and bigoted folks on the far right that are just telling you to be hateful and bigoted and make America great again by setting up prison camps for immigrants. You're not going to hear it from them. This is unique. We're putting out a unique political brand here. This is something very, very special. A lot of people are threatened by it because it's so special. But I love you all. You are all my friends, and I think we're going to wrap it up here. It's been a fun 2-hour live here. My best wishes to all of you. Stay strong. Power to the people. Justice will prevail. We're in a world ruled by greed, but human beings, with our brilliance and creativity, our knack for scientific thinking, we will overcome the rule of the dollar and build a society where human life and human development and reason take charge. So all my best wishes to everyone. Signing off. Yes, all my best wishes to everyone, and have a very happy day. All my best wishes, and we are going to wrap up. So, all my best wishes. Let me just conclude by saying, listen to classical music, folks. Capitalist media is constantly urging us to be as emotional as we possibly can. I told you all how I feel like my mistakes are rooted in that kind of religious thinking. Well, that kind of passion overriding rational thought is rooted in emotion, and that classical music before Wagner, music like Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, Brahms, that kind of music, Haydn, that has an intellectual appeal, that is appealing to the part of your brain that notices patterns, that's not just trying to get you to be really emotional, but is stimulating you intellectually, can be very, very good for your brain. Listen to classical music. Try to not let the emotionalism of U.S. society override you. We're surrounded by pornography in U.S. society. We're surrounded by advertisements and media that is just trying to get us to be as emotional as possible. But emotions are not what separate human beings from animals. Animals are very, very emotional creatures at the end of the day. Animals can have emotions. They can be full of rage. They can be sexual. But what makes human beings special is our ability to notice patterns, and our ability to be rational and scientific, and our ability to put our emotions on hold and really grasp the world, change our environment, develop and build a real civilization. That's what separates human beings from animals. So try not to get caught up in the pornographic emotions of U.S. society. Listen to classical music when you can. Listen to other music. I listen to other music. I love folk music. Folk music can be emotional, not always. I love rock music and all that, but I start every day with Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, or Haydn. I try to end every day with it. It's very helpful. If you can get past the emotionalism
the pornography, the aggression of this society, and think more rationally, we can all be into a better place. So I urge everyone to listen to classical music. It's an antidote to the irrationality of a society based on greed. So on that note, we are going to conclude. Bye-bye.